Let's see. What do we have here? To enterprising young men. That sounds interesting, doesn't it?
Huh. You ain't got the skin for it, Hugh. That there is a suicide mission. Going out into the untamed. You'll lose your scalp before you even catch one beaver. Promise you that.
Well, I ain't lost it yet. Think it pays well?
Hell if I know. Those fellers are crazy enough to eat the devil with horns. You ain't thinking of going now, are you?
I just might. I could use a fresh start after the journey I've been on.
Well, best of luck to you, Hugh. Hope you make it out alright.
Thanks. Better be going then. The West is awaiting.
Reminder: what you just heard is a fictional story, based off of true events. Howdy, and welcome back to Wild West Deep Dives. Hugh Glass, known as the legendary fur trapper that survived a bear attack and had an almost unbelievable story of survival, as well as being the inspiration behind the movie The Revenant. But did you know he was a pirate? You're damn right, Hugh Glass was a pirate. There is a whole lot more to Hugh Glass than Hollywood portrayed. We got pirates, we got Native Americans, we got a bear attack, and most importantly, we have his damn rifle. Well, let's get into it, shall we? My name's Steven, and this is Wild West Deep Dives. Hugh Glass was born in 1783 in Pennsylvania to Irish parents that immigrated from modern-day Northern Ireland. I think. There's unfortunately very little information about his childhood at all. There's some speculation that Hugh served as an apprentice to a gunsmith in Pennsylvania as a teen, but this isn't verified. According to the book, The Saga of Hugh Glass, by John Myers Myers, which is an excellent book and served as a great source for this series. Myers talks about how Glass confided in one biographer about his early life. Unfortunately, this was never published and could never be located. If it ever is located, it may provide information to fill in the gaps of Hugh's childhood. These are a few of the more important sources that give us a look into the amazing life of Hugh Glass. I used a piece of each of them to try to put together the most accurate story I could for this series. The first time Hugh Glass ever appears in public print is in the 1825 edition of a Philadelphia publication called The Portfolio, in a section titled Letters from the West, the Missouri Trapper, by James Hall. The next is the work of Lieutenant Philip St. George Cook in Some Incidents in the Life of Hugh Glass, a Hunter of the Missouri, in late 1830. Then there was Edmund Flagg, who wrote an article titled Adventures at the Headwaters of the Missouri. Lastly was the account of George C. Young in his work The Adventures of Hugh Glass, written in the 1850s. Also, Young recounted his memoirs to a Catholic priest named Reverend Orange Clark, who wrote a book, but it was not published until 1923, when Charles Lewis Camp edited the memoirs recorded by Clark and published them in the California Historical Society. There are countless other works and accounts of Hugh Glass, such as Prince Maximilian, Rufus Age, as well as accounts from fellow fur trappers James Beckworth, James Kleiman, Daniel Potts. The list goes on and on, but the ones I listed are probably the most popular accounts, books, articles, etc. John Myers Myers' work in his book and the website hughglass.org are a combination of all the accounts and information put into one book and website, and these were the two main sources I used, while making sure to look into every detail I could find on Hugh's life. With all these sources, we still know essentially nothing of Hugh Glass's childhood. Sometime between the years 1817 and 1820. No one knows for sure, but Hugh Glass was a sailor. He could have even possibly been a commander on an American ship. Hugh was likely in his 30s at the time, but we can't be certain because we don't know exactly when he was born. While on the high sea, his ship was seized by the crew of the infamous French pirate Jean Lafitte. The crew then gave him a choice: become a pirate, or as the old saying goes, walk the plank. Since we all know of Hugh Glass being a famous fur trapper, he obviously chose to become a pirate. Here's a bit of background on Jean Lafitte. Born around 1780, most likely in France or a French colony, Lafitte eventually made his way to New Orleans by 1810, where he was described as a man full of maturity, speaking French fluently. However, the details of his early life and how he came to be in New Orleans remain elusive. What is known is that he was regarded as a scoundrel, though he only admitted to only one type of criminal activity: smuggling. He maintained that it was the restrictive American laws, particularly the 1807 trade embargo with France and Britain amid the Napoleonic Wars, that forced his hand and drove him to these illicit operations. With merchants in the United States struggling to obtain the goods their customers demanded, Lafitte saw an opportunity to step in as a so-called privateer, capturing enemy ships and their valuable cargo. He claimed to have the blessing of the government in the rebellious city of Cartagena in present-day Colombia, which is at odds with the Spanish crown, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. However, the US government did not recognize Cartagena's authority and instead branded Lafitte and his crew as common pirates, charging them with the serious crime of piracy. But Jean Lafitte went from ruthless pirate to an American patriot during the War of 1812. After Napoleon's defeat in 1814, the British were able to focus on coastal regions and American trade and transportation. They attacked Washington in August of 1814 and planned to attack New Orleans. Commander Andrew Jackson, a major general at the time, gathered an army in New Orleans, which included Tennessee and Kentucky frontiersmen, Louisiana militia, New Orleans businessmen, free men of color, Choctaw Indians, United States troops, and smuggler Jean Lafitte with his privateers, sailors, and Marines. But Andrew Jackson was one of the many men that would have admired watching Jean Lafitte swing. But with his army being without the artillery needed to properly fight against a well-armed, well-trained Royal Navy, he was forced to use anything and anyone at his disposal. What Jean Lafitte had that General Jackson did not have was cannons, and the men trained in how to use them. On the 8th of January 1815, Jackson's hastily assembled army defeated a battle-hardened British force. This was the last major armed engagement between the United States and Great Britain. As Meyer states in his book, quote, "Those of them who manned the cannon they had brought ashore were deft at scoring with them, fired in tune to the pitch and roll of ships afloat. Aiming from firm emplacements, they displayed a marksmanship to match the rifles of the frontier hunters, who made up the body of Jackson's force. Veterans of the Napoleonic Wars though they were, the British had never been up against such a deadly combination. Neither before nor since, it can be affirmed, has an English army been beaten so badly by a force which gave away odds of better than 2 to 1. According to battlefields.org, here are the numbers. The amount of forces engaged totaled 13,700. 8,000 on the British side, 5,700 on the United States side. Estimated casualties were 2,096, with the British suffering 2,034 of those, and the United States only suffering 62. The notorious pirate Jean Lafitte was no stranger to controversy and danger. After establishing his base of operations in the treacherous Texas wilderness, Lafitte continued his life of freebootery, frequently feuding with the Spanish authorities who sought to bring an end to his lawless ways. But in 1817, Lafitte decided it was time to relocate, and he set his sights on a new territory to call home. He would name it Campeche. Situated along the coast, Campeche was a precarious place to set up shop, surrounded by hazards on all sides. The mainland on both banks of the bay were infested with the fearsome Karankawa tribe, a group of indigenous people who were rumored to be 7-foot-tall cannibals, believing that consuming the flesh of their enemies would grant them their power and abilities. The murky, swampy waters were also teeming with deadly threats. From venomous snakes to massive alligators, it was a treacherous, unforgiving landscape. Campeche is in the place of modern-day Galveston. Around the time that Campeche was being established, Lafitte's crew was busy capturing Hugh Glass's ship somewhere off the coast of Texas. The crew boarded, and each took their share of goods. They looked at each man physically and decided whether they were hardy enough to be part of their crew. The others would either be slain or tossed overboard. Jean Lafitte was trying to grow his gang of pirates. Headquartered at Campeche, he had many branches of his gang, and each crew answered to him. This is when the crew made Hugh decide, join them or die. The cards he was dealt were bad regardless, but as Hugh would prove in the years to come throughout his life, he had a strong will to live. Glass's time as a pirate was a harsh experience. George Young writes in the Chronicles of George C. Young that after Hugh took the oath of allegiance to the crew, quote, all went well for a season, but the cruel murders to be perpetrated daily, as they shuddered from their inmost souls and shrunk from those deeds of blood, it was impossible for them to conceal from their despotic lord the emotions of their hearts. Myers then writes about how Glass told George Young that, quote, the reality of being a pirate far topped in horror any vision of the trade possible to one who hadn't been enmeshed in it. There are monstrosities of conduct belonging to a society which has cut itself off from honor and compassion that outsiders can only stand at the price of forced association. There is not much information of Hugh's actions as part of Lafitte's crew. What we do know is that Hugh wanted to escape, but the task seemed impossible. The bay that surrounded Campeche was full of alligators, poisonous snakes, and the cannibal tribe of the Karankawa. Myers tells of the Karankawa Indians who populated the mainland on both sides of Galveston Bay were the tribe known for their fierce, cannibalistic tendencies, a fact that had been tragically learned by many men who ventured into their territory, only to meet a grisly end. These hardy cannibals, as they were described, were not to be trifled with. Crossing the channel to hunt for fresh meat that was otherwise difficult to come by, a group of men once tried to abduct a Karankawa squaw. However, they were so thoroughly overpowered that 3 to 5 of them, accounts vary on the exact number, ended up becoming the meal, rather than procuring one. The lone survivor's account painted a disturbing picture of the Karankawa feasting on their victims. While cannibalism was relatively rare among North American tribes, the Karankawa seemed to practice it with little reservation. For most groups that did engage in the consumption of human flesh, it was typically a ceremonial act, driven by beliefs about gaining the attributes of the deceased. The Tonkawa tribe of Texas, for instance, would only eat the hands and feet of enemy warriors killed in battle, believing this would transfer the fallen's physical prowess to the consumer. The Karankawa, on the other hand, appeared to indulge in cannibalism as a means of sustenance, with little regard for ritual or spiritual significance. Hugh Glass and another quote-unquote pirate found themselves in a precarious position aboard the cruise ship. Like Hugh, this man likely had been forced into a life of piracy, desperately seeking an opportunity to escape his dire circumstances. When the Lafitte crew ordered the pair to carry out some unsavory pirate tasks, they protested, unwilling to fully embrace the ruthless lifestyle. Fortunately for them, the crew lacked the authority to sentence them to death, but they knew their defiance would have to be answered by the fearsome Jean Lafitte himself. With a looming death sentence hanging over their heads, the two men anxiously plotted their escape, their only hope for survival. As the crew prepared to row ashore for a night of revelry, drinking, and indulging in the company of disreputable women, Hugh and his companion seized their chance. While the obedient pirates would do their duty and respond to commands at sea, they could not resist the allure of such indulging festivities. It's unclear why, but Hugh and the other man were left alone on the ship. It can be guessed that because of their recent inaction, the crew decided to not include them in the fun, but it isn't verified. Regardless, the two men quickly gathered all they could: a knife, flint and steel, some trade goods for Indians, and a scant amount of food, and made their daring leap over the side, plunging in the inky blackness of the open water. The men battled deadly creatures and overwhelming currents, but the prospect of facing Lafitte's wrath was far more terrifying. The men had endured a grueling 2-mile journey. Their muscles ached and their clothes clung to their bodies as they finally dragged themselves ashore, but their ordeal was far from over. With no firearms and little provisions, their journey was just getting underway. They now found themselves in the treacherous lands of the Karankawa Indians. If you're like me, every time in my research that the Karankawa tribe came up, I wondered, were they actually cannibals, or is this some type of scary campfire story? Well, according to a man named Tim Sider, who at the time of writing the article was a Southern Methodist University graduate student, he also did a presentation with a Karankawa descendant. I'll link the video in the show notes. Side note, I will list every source for every episode in the show notes, so if you want to take an even deeper dive into everything we discuss, it'll all be there. Mr. Sider talks about how his research revealed that the myths about the Karankawas were somewhat untrue. Although they were taller than the average European, with the men of the tribe averaging 5 foot 8 inches, they were not 7 feet. More importantly, the cannibal talk wasn't entirely just a legend. They practiced a ceremonial form of cannibalism, in which they did believe it gave them the powers of their foes. But as Sider says, this practice ended in the late 1600s. With Hugh and his escapee partner traveling through the territory around the late 1810s and early 1820s, they did not seem to be at risk of any cannibal activities, but it is doubtful that they knew that. As Hugh Glass and his companions struggled to make their way north through the vast, uncharted wilderness, they were forced to rely entirely on their wits and survival skills in order to stay alive. With no horses, weapons, and little supplies to aid them, the two men had to forage and hunt for every scrap of food they could find, subsisting on a meager diet of snakes, frogs, and other small game that they could scrounge up. As they pushed deeper into the interior, the game became more and more elusive, forcing them to contend with growing hunger and desperation. While on the journey, the ever-wary worry of ferocious native tribes never left their mind. As Myers states, quote, Indians were apt to welcome any opportunity to lift hair. Especially dangerous to ill-armed strays, were young bucks eager to prove themselves, chiefs anxious to supply the wherewithal of a scalp dance, or a disappointed war party on the lookout for any face-saving price. As the now lost men kept wandering north, they traveled through Indian territory hoping to run into people that would help them, not the ones that wanted their scalps. They passed through the territory of the Karankawas, which we've talked enough about, the Tonkawas, who were also rumored to be ceremonial cannibals. They passed through the hunting grounds of the Osages. They even traveled through the territory of one of the most hostile and deadly tribes known to mankind, the Comanches, that will come up in future series for their ability to send chills down the spines of the toughest characters of the West. They had made it 1,000 miles from the area that they made their great escape, with their scalps still intact, but their luck had run out. Somewhere in modern-day Kansas, or possibly Nebraska, the pair were captured by a band of Pawnees. More precisely, the Wolf or Loup Pawnee, one of the 4 bands of the Pawnee. The Wolf Pawnees were one of the tribes of the plains that believed in human sacrifice, for 2 different purposes. First was pyromancy, which is a practice that uses human ashes as tea leaves. It's believed that it gave them the power of reading the future. The second was that it pleased the tribal gods. Myers talks in his book, telling about the favored ceremony of the Loup Pawnee. Quote, a favored ceremony of these Pawnees was the burning of a young girl as a tribute to the planet Venus and its capacity as the morning star. By the time the Americans first met the Loups, though, the honor of being turned into cinder to win a smile from the morning star had been passed on to squaws captured from other nations. As late as 1832, an American Indian agent saved a young Cheyenne woman from this fate, without, however, much prolonging her life. Although he gained custody of her by paying an agreed ransom fee, a mob of Pawnees were in wait when he tried to ride off with the reprieve victim. Outraged by the thought of the Morning Star's disappointment, the Loups literally and without delay tore the girl to pieces. This is who the 2 men were captured by, and it would leave a scarring impression on Hugh Glass. The Wolf Pawnees had a choice to make, which of these 2 men they would sacrifice first. The tribe chose the other man, and Glass was forced to watch his friend burn at the stake while being stabbed with burning pines as a form of ritual sacrifice. Glass, while watching the horrific scene and processing what was actually happening, soon realized that he would be next to suffer the same fate. The Pawnee tribe had a distinct cultural practice when it came to honoring and dedicating victims to the gods and spirits. Rather than treating their captives or sacrifices with cruelty, the Pawnee emphasized treating them with the utmost care and respect. This was seen as a way to show reverence to the gods to whom Hugh would ultimately be offered. But the time had finally come. As they hoisted Hugh Glass to his final resting place, the hollers and whoops of the Pawnee loudened. Then Hugh made one last effort to avoid his sacrifice. Perhaps driven by desperation or drawing upon some obscure knowledge from his past experiences, reached for a parcel containing a bright red pigment known as vermilion. This vivid, cinnabar-based pigment was commonly used by many tribes for decorative and ceremonial purposes, often as a key component in their traditional war paint. The moment Glass produced the vermilion, everything changed. The Pawnee chief recognized it as a sign from the Great Spirit, signaling that Glass was a blessed individual, not one meant for sacrifice, but for adoption into their tribe. Immediately, the chief announced that Glass would be welcomed as his own son, and the tribe erupted into celebratory feasting to honor their new kinsman. Hugh Glass's time living among the Pawnee tribe was a formative experience that would shape the rest of his life and career. Immersed in their way of life, he gained knowledge and skills that he would later rely upon. For several years, he lived as a true Indian, living in a crowded teepee with, quote, his foster father, 2 or 3 foster mothers, and a range of foster brothers and sisters. Hugh Glass no doubt took to the warpath with the Pawnees frequently, against their chief rivals, the Cheyenne, Comanche, and Sioux tribes that also roamed the Great Plains. Yet despite these violent conflicts, the Pawnees maintained peaceful relations with the neighboring Arikara people, a fellow Caddoan nation whose language was so similar that only the most discerning ear could distinguish between the two. The weapons which Hugh used in war can only be guessed. Historians think he would have used a lance, which is a Native American spear, a tomahawk, as well as a firearm. The firearm, if he had one, would have most likely been traded for via the Arikara. And what you will learn later on in the series, Hugh Glass's rifle was very, very important to him. He loved his rifle. But was this the rifle that he carried with him for the remainder of his days as a frontiersman? Unfortunately, historians have not been able to verify when exactly Hugh received his coveted rifle. If you remember, he may have served as an apprentice for a gunsmith back as a teenager. But it's unlikely he received it then, because if he did, Jean Lafitte's crew most definitely would have taken it. He acquired an education that could never be learned via a textbook, but through true determination and a will to live, he learned valuable knowledge. For even when the hunting grounds of the West were at their height, the game ranged a large area with no borders. Therefore, nomad hunting tribes like the Wolf Pawnee would travel to the hunting grounds, but also have emergency rations shall game get scarce. Having had the wisdom of generations of knowledge passed on them from their ancestors about the edible properties of aquatic and insect life, along with the plant life, the Pawnee passed this knowledge on to Hugh Glass. Learning their way of life, their knowledge, their culture, and their skills, he fully embraced this way of life. You'll see in some sources that claim that Hugh had a Pawnee wife and maybe a Pawnee baby, but there is no historical evidence that he did. Is it possible? I'm almost sure that he had some type of relationship, because it was very common for fur trappers to take a native wife, but he never talked about it, and there is no evidence showing that he did. Then, another huge change came to Hugh Glass's life. In 1822, the United States Superintendent of Indian Affairs, none other than William Clark, from the Lewis and Clark expedition, came to St. Louis to meet with the native tribes. His mission was to establish peaceful relations with the tribes on and west of the Missouri River. The fur trade was alive and well. Therefore, if Clark could negotiate peace with the tribes, the freedom to go west and trap for beaver could be done without fear of Indian attacks. This is when the Pawnee visited St. Louis and Hugh Glass was with them. They came to, as a famous saying goes, smoke the peace pipe. It isn't entirely clear if the Pawnee chief let Hugh go, or if he took his opportunity and left the tribe, but regardless, the Pawnee went back to their home grounds without Hugh Glass in tow. This is when Hugh Glass answered the call for 100 enterprising young men. We're going to divert a bit and give a quick background of the North American fur trade that takes us all the way up to Hugh Glass's entry. I plan on doing a full series on the entire history of the fur trade in North America. Please email me if you would enjoy this. It'll give me added motivation to get it done. WildWestDeepDives@gmail.com. According to Legends of America, who is a great source on this topic, quote, "The North American fur trade was the acquisition, exchange, and sale of animal furs in North America. Native Americans in the United States and Canada traded among themselves before European arrival, and immediately began to trade with the newcomers. In the 16th century, the wearing of beaver felt hats became fashionable across Europe. According to Bernard Hats, quote, "The production of the actual beaver hats required a process called felting. Beaver fur has tiny barbs on the ends, which, when pressed, interlock to form a solid fabric called felt. This water-resistant quality of beaver hats, along with their wide brims, made them an ideal choice for the rainy English climate, especially before the invention of the umbrella. With the value of beaver pelt skyrocketing and beaver going nearly extinct in Europe, it led to a migration of fur traders to North America. The fur trade became a cornerstone of the North American economy, attracting fierce competition among the colonial powers of Europe, who sought to capitalize on this lucrative industry. For centuries, the fur trade was the driving force shaping the early history and development of the United States and Canada. Many Native American societies across a vast expanse of the continent came to rely on the fur trade as their primary means of generating income, in the form of securing valuable goods in exchange for furs. The earliest participants in the fur trade were the French, who established a thriving network along the St. Lawrence and Ottawa rivers, as well as the Mississippi. As the Dutch arrived, they too developed a robust fur trading operation centered in Albany. In 1670, King Charles II granted a royal charter, which essentially means permission to, quote, "the Governor and Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson Bay," which began establishing trading posts along the shores of Hudson Bay. This was the creation of the Hudson Bay Company, which would be one of the more dominant companies in North America for several centuries. In 1779, the Northwest Fur Company was founded by a group of 9 different men. It would serve as the main competitor of the Hudson Bay Company. This northern region saw intense competition and conflict between the French and English interests vying for control of the lucrative fur resources. In 1811-1812, the Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Company's territory began to run mighty close to one another. For years, the two companies had heated exchanges and conflicts. Under the pressure from the British government, the Northwest Company and Hudson's Bay Company merged in 1821 to form one company, and they kept the title of Hudson's Bay Company. The United States' first millionaire, John Jacob Astor, founded the American or Pacific Fur Company in 1810 to control fur trading in the Columbia River and Great Lakes areas. Astor financed 2 expeditions, the Overland Astor Expedition, which was led by Wilson Price Hunt. This is also known as the Hunt Expedition of 1810. The second was a sea expedition that sailed around Cape Horn to the Pacific Northwest. In 1811, the company established Fort Astoria. It was the first permanent United States community on the Pacific coast in Oregon. But the War of 1812 came close to destroying the Pacific Fur Company, after the British took control of Fort Astoria and Astor was forced to sell it. However, in 1817, Congress passed an act that prohibited foreign traders from United States territory. Then in 1821, the company partnered with Chateau interests of St. Louis, Missouri, and it gave the company a monopoly in the Missouri River region and later in the Rocky Mountains. The 19th century represented the peak of North American fur trade's economic importance, a period marked by the expansion of elaborate trade networks and the rise of powerful fur trading companies. Now I just scratched the very surface. There is so much history and I left a lot of it out, and I mean a whole lot. Like I said, I'd love to do a full series on this topic in the future. In 1822, The War Department began granting license to trade in Indian Territory to all applicants in good standing with the law. William Henry Ashley, Missouri's first lieutenant governor, had never been involved in the fur trade, but had tried to learn everything he could from people who had been deep in the western wilderness. In early 1822, he gained the license to let him trap in Indian Territory. In partnership with Ashley was Major Andrew Henry. He was part of the Corps Discovery in the Lewis and Clark expedition. The men then began recruiting 100 enterprising young men. This is a famous ad read in its entirety. Quote, "To enterprising young men, the subscriber wishes to engage 100 men who ascend the river Missouri to its source, there to be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years. For particulars, inquire to Major Andrew Henry near the lead mines in the county of Washington, who will ascend with and command the party. Order the subscriber at St. Louis, W.M.H. Ashley." Among the first men who answered the advertisements were the legendary Jedediah Smith, Daniel T. Potts, and a young Jim Bridger. Their plan was to establish a fort along the upper Missouri River, supply it via keelboat, and use it as a base of operations in which to send trappers out into the mountains. According to True West magazine, Ashley and Henry were in a rush to get going. They weren't the only expedition attempting to go north. They had the Missouri Fur Company, led by Joseph Pilcher, and other companies working hard to head out as well. But the goods were late in arriving in St. Louis, and with the purchase of a second keelboat falling through, it led Henry to make the decision to take the men and supplies they had and go north. Finally, the first expedition with the first 100 men, possibly up to 150 men, under Major Henry's command left St. Louis in March of 1822. Although, they did not make it as far as they wanted. According to Meyer's book, quote, "They were 440 yards beyond the mouth of the Yellowstone." Regardless, they then began to construct a fort as a base for their operations. The fort would be named Fort Henry. William Ashley was not on this first trip. He stayed in St. Louis waiting on the arrival of the goods. On the 8th of May, a second keelboat, loaded with men and supplies, left St. Louis. It was named the Enterprise and was commanded by Daniel S.D. Moore. When Moore unexpectedly returned to St. Louis on the 3rd of June without his boat, Ashley was surprised to say the least. According to reports, the Enterprise had sunk about 260 miles upstream, and about $10,000 worth of supplies were lost, though the men aboard survived. $10,000 in 1822 is about $270,000 today. A third expedition, which was led by Ashley himself, left St. Louis and arrived at the Yellowstone River, and he finally met back up with Andrew Henry in October of 1822. Ashley and Henry now believed that they had a foothold in the West. They had a fort built, they had men that they could send out to trap, and the supplies in which to supply them with. William Ashley then traveled back to St. Louis to retrieve more supplies and more men. But he wouldn't leave St. Louis until March of 1823. This is when Hugh Glass joined the fur trade. After leaving the Pawnee tribe in St. Louis, he remained west in the Mississippi. It is a wonder why he didn't return back east, to where he lived before he was captured by Jean Lafitte's crew. It is believed that Glass was in his 30s when he was captured. Therefore, historians can assume that a man of 30 was married and that he could have returned to his wife. But as John Myers puts in his book, The Saga of Hugh Glass, quote, "With his tour duty as a pirate and his later enlistment as a Pawnee, he had been absent from his presumptive home for something like 5 years before he reached a path which could take him back there." He continues with, "It doesn't take a poet's imagination to see that a man out of ken for a lustrum might find himself replaced by a wife who had every right to think herself a widow." But historians cannot confirm if Hugh Glass was even married, so that thought is not a sure fact. It's most likely that he didn't return to the life as a mariner because of his pirate experience, and frankly, he may have wanted to stay west. Many men were drawn to the west to go experience the wild country, a fresh start. With his experience with the Pawnee and learning the necessary skills in survival and hunting, he could carve out a good living in the fur trade. But, as I always strive for accuracy on this podcast, and I am nowhere close to being an expert on the subject, We may never know why exactly Hugh Glass stayed west, but what we do know is that he did. If you remember the story that I told at the beginning of the series, this is sort of what I was talking about, how he had been through a lot already and could have just wanted to stay west for a fresh start. Side note, this could have been the time that Hugh Glass got his coveted rifle. There is no documented evidence, but many fur trappers noted at the beauty of Hugh Glass's rifle. We can assume that he either bought a new one and did some of his own work on it, remember, he was possibly an apprentice for a gunsmith as a teenager, or the rifle he received when he was with the Pawnee could have accompanied him to St. Louis, where he would make the necessary repairs. But he would leave St. Louis with his coveted rifle. The first expedition of Ashley's 100 left in March of 1822. Hugh Glass was most likely still with the Pawnee, as we do not know exactly when the Pawnee came to St. Louis, but we know for a fact he was not on any of the first 3 expeditions. But what we do know is that on the 7th of March 1823, he boarded the keelboat Rocky Mountain or the Yellowstone Packet. If you're wondering what a keelboat is, Keelboat, according to the National Park Service, keelboats typically range from 40 to 80 feet long and 8 to 12 feet wide, and came to a point at the bow and stern. When fully loaded, the average keelboat drew 2 feet of water, which made it ideal for traveling in shallow waters. I'll include a link to a picture of one in the show notes. They were propelled by rowing, wind, or in the expedition's case, a technique known as poling, where they used long poles that each man would anchor into the bottom and use the pole to push the boat forward. Another technique used by the expedition when possible was having a group of men on shore with ropes and having them pull the boat. As you may assume, this was grueling on the men. Then add in the fact that they were going upstream against the current on a windy Missouri River, the task was rigorous and not for the faint of heart. Along with Hugh Glass, you had other legendary figures in their own right. Men like Tom Fitzpatrick, James Clyman, and possibly Ed Rose. But like you'll learn in our next short dive episode, wink wink, no one is quite sure where or what a man like Five Scalps was up to. Before we go into Hugh Glass's journey up the Missouri, I wanted to take a minute to dive deeper on the journey of these first 2 keelboats of Ashley and Henry's expedition, just to show how dangerous the traveling really was. From the Missouri Republican on the 12th of March 1822, quote, 2 keelboats belonging to General Ashley left this place Monday for Yellowstone for the purpose of hunting and trapping. We understand a man fell overboard from one of the boats on Monday and was drowned. Just 1 week later, the Republic wrote about a story which was headed with affecting occasion, stating, quote, on Thursday morning last, 3 men belonging to General Ashley's expedition to the Yellowstone were conveying a quantity of powder in a cart to the boats at St. Charles. When fire was communicated to the powder by means of a pipe, the men were blown into the air to the height of several hundred feet, and the cart shivered to pieces, and the horses much injured. One of them survived a few minutes after his descent to the ground. The others were entirely lifeless and burnt in the most shocking manner. For the remainder of the episode, I'm going to refer to the first series of keelboats, the one commanded by Henry that built the fort, and Ashley's boat, the 3rd boat of the expedition. Remember, the 2nd boat commanded by Moore capsized and never made it, but I will refer to this party as Henry's party. Then William Ashley's later party that involved Hugh Glass, I'll refer to as Ashley's party. I think it'll make it easier for y'all to understand, because I will be bouncing back and forth from each. When Ashley's party were all boarded up, they began their journey up the snag-filled, curve-filled Missouri. Remember, they had to travel against the current, poling and pulling the boats. With 15 miles being a good day, the approximately 2,000 river-mile journey from St. Louis to the mouth of the Yellowstone was a daunting task to say it lightly. Ashley's party had 100 men as well, with 50 of them being hunters, like Hugh Glass, and 50 boatmen, who were tasked with getting the Rocky Mountain and Yellowstone packet to the company's trading post. As Hugh Glass and Ashley's party struggled their way up the Missouri, Daniel Potts, who traveled with Henry's advance party, wrote a journal of his time with the fur trade, and it gives us vital information of the day-to-day life of these mountaineers. He writes, quote, "I ascended the Missouri and arrived at the mouth of the Musselshell on the latter end of November, where I wintered with 13 others. Here was a remarkable escape of my scout, as 2 large parties of Indians wintered within 20 miles of us, and our better enemies, the Blackfeet. This is a testament to the daily battles these men faced." But Potts was not a useful mountaineer for long, after a fellow comrade accidentally shot Potts through both of his knees. 2 men took him back to Fort Henry, as there were only 11 men present for the upcoming event. The 11 men continued to travel west of the Great Falls, near the mouth of Smith River, when on the 4th of May, a Blackfeet war party caught up to them. 4 men were killed, as only 7 would return back to Fort Henry. When Ashley's party made it to roughly modern-day central South Dakota, just a few miles south of the mouth of the Grain River, Jedediah Smith arrived by canoe with an urgent message for William Ashley. It was from Major Henry. He desperately needed horses because of the raid by the Assiniboine Indians that made way with a large number of their horses. The rivers that led into the mountains were not suitable for the large keelboats. Therefore, the men at Fort Henry needed horses to get the trappers into the mountains and also have a fighting chance against hostile natives. But the message had good timing. Ashley's party had not yet reached the Arikara villages, where horse trading was of great value. It was located north of the Grand River. As the boats and men traveled up the Missouri, they would pass through the territories of the Omahas and Poncas, the Sioux, Arikaras, Mandans, Minnetarees or Hidatsas, the Cheyennes, the Crows, and the Assiniboines. In 1823, 2 Arikara villages dominated a bend in the Missouri and were home to around 2,500 people. The Arikaras, Ree or Piccaries as the men often called them, were a somewhat advanced tribe of Native Americans, meaning they did not move around with game or seasons like most tribes did on the Great Plains. They instead built permanent lodges that were fortified, sort of like a Native American version of a fort. They were also farmers. They produced corn, beans, tobacco, and squash. The location of their villages were at a point where goods could be filtered up the Missouri. They were also openly friendly with other native tribes, and oversaw the trading between tribes at their village. But when it came to white traders, it could go either way. Here's a quick description of what the village looked like. A log fence-like perimeter surrounded the villages, and inside them were earth lodges. The framework of logs, covered with willow branches and packed with dirt made rounded, created a weatherproof and bulletproof living home for the residents of the village. The village overlooked an open beach area of the Missouri River, and the 2 villages created a sort of native trading post. On the 30th of May, 1823, Ashley's party arrived at the villages and anchored their keelboats midstream, and Ashley made it clear that he did not want to fight. He wanted to trade. When Ashley and 1 other man went to the village at the invitation of the chief, Ashley learned that the Rees had no issues with the palefaces, only the one that they had with the Missouri Fur Company. But the Arikaras wanted compensation for the killing of several warriors in the recent fight with the Missouri Fur Company. In the winter of 1808-09, Manuel Lisa formed the St. Louis Missouri Company, in which Major Andrew Henry was a partner. This is the company he went over the Rocky Mountains with. In 1819, the company reorganized and became the Missouri Fur Company. It was headed by a man named Joseph Pilcher and was assisted by many veterans of the trade and of the West. The attack that took place that the Arikara warriors may be referencing goes something along these lines. A party of men from the Missouri Fur Company were moving up the Yellowstone under Michael Amell and Robert Jones. They had met near Pryor's Fork when they were ambushed by 300 to 400 Blackfeet warriors, and it seems like some Arikara warriors were involved. Myers tells in his book that neither Jones or Amell survived to tell the story. but a man named William Gordon wrote a letter to Joseph Pilcher, stating, quote, "They lay an ambush for us on the side of a steep hill, the base of which was washed by the river, along which we had to pursue the intricate windings of a buffalo trace, among rocks, tree, etc., among which they had secreted themselves. At this place, the men were of course much scattered for a considerable distance, as 2 horses could not pass abreast. At this unfortunate moment, and under circumstances so disadvantageous, they rushed upon us with whole force, pouring down from every quarter. 7 men from the party were killed, and several more were wounded. The survivors escaped via raft, and while they were making their escape, the Blackfeet warriors celebrated their victory by counting horses, pelts, and most importantly, scalps. This is a situation that fur trappers were in on a daily basis. Each decision, each move was critical. One false move could mean death. On the morning of the 1st of June, the village and the trappers met on the beach that separated the river where the trappers were and the villages where the Arikara were, and the trading commenced. Ashley would walk away with 40 to 50 horses, and the Arikaras walked away happy with what they received. Legend says that in his eagerness to secure mounts, Ashley supplied the Arikaras with firearms. But according to his own word, 75% of the firearms that Arikaras had were from the Hudson's Bay Company. He described them as, quote, London Fusiliers. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, I barely know English. Back to the topic. What the Arikara were really short of was gunpowder, and Ashley was willing to trade his powder for mounts. Trading ended when Ashley stated that he had no more weapons to give. But Ashley's party now had enough horses for Major Henry's party, and were happy with their haul. Ashley wanted to show no fear, but also no hostility. He believed that it would make the Arikaras respect their party and allow them to travel upriver unchallenged by the village. Ashley then split his men into a river group that would be with the boats and an overland group to guard and care for the horses. He put Jedediah Smith, along with Hugh Glass, Jim Kleiman, Thomas Fitzpatrick, Bill Sublett, and other men, a total of 40 who were labeled as hunters, in the overland group on the beach to take care of the horses. The rest were on the boat. These men, labeled as boatmen, were about 30 yards offshore. The men on the beach had hunkered down for the night, but there was only 38 of them. Edward Rose had a past relationship with the Arikara, and who may have preferred the company of native villagers over that of the white men. He was in the village, along with a man named Aaron Stevens. Rose was welcome. Stevens was not. Ashley gave orders that at sunup, both parties were to head out. Ashley then went to sleep, with little worry or fear of an attack by the Arikara. At approximately 3 a.m., he was awakened suddenly. He could hear screams and war whoops coming from the lower end of the village. Edward Rose came running back to camp, and told the men ashore that Stevens had been killed by the Arikara, and they were planning a sneak attack. They argued amongst themselves about what to do: try and recover Stevens' body, or swim the horses to the opposite bank. They chose to stand and fight. Under the cover of rain, the Arikara warriors ventured out of their villages and took up firing positions in some thick brush on one end of the beach, while others hid behind some driftwood on the other end. With the main attack coming from the center, they could have the men on the beach surrounded by a wall of gunfire. Just before sunup, one Arikara warrior yelled to the men on the shore that he would go retrieve Stevens' body for the price of 1 horse. This was agreed upon, but when the Arikara warrior returned to tell them that Stevens' body was so mangled that there was no longer enough to return, the trappers settled in for a fight. As the sun started to put light on the situation, the trappers on shore saw how bad their situation was. They were looking uphill to the riverbank, lined by a wall of earth. They were going to be shot down on by these Arikara warriors, like fish in a bowl. When they looked toward the river, they noticed the 2 keelboats, bobbing in the water with their skiffs on the side, doing the same. The men were ready, but weary. Suddenly, the stillness is broken. Dead horses quickly began to stack up, but it provided a barricade for the men on shore, and the trappers began returning fire. Some men began to call out to the keelboats to come ashore. When Ashley ordered his men to get the boats ashore, the boatmen froze, inexperienced in these circumstances. Ashley once again ordered the men to put the boats ashore. Finally, one boat acted, but ran aground on the sandbar. The other, worried about their situation, made for the opposite bank, out of rifle range. Some of the harder frontiersmen on this boat acted independently and got the skiffs in the water and made for the shore. The trappers were fighting fiercely, but men were getting hit and the wounded soon began to accumulate. There were 2 skiffs coming ashore to rescue the men and began taking the wounded to the boats. The first skiff picked up 4 men. 2 were dead, 2 others wounded. He dropped the men off the boat, but as he made his way back to the shore, he was shot and killed, and the skiff then set adrift downstream. As the men on shore realized that their bullets weren't causing nearly the same damage as the warriors' bullets were, they began to retreat, but soon saw that there were no skiffs. The other skiff had made it back to the boat, but had not returned. Their only chance now was to swim. Ashley would write later after the battle, quote, "Some swam to the boats, others were shot down in the edge of the water and immediately sunk, and the others, who appeared to be badly wounded, sunk in attempting to swim." Legend says that Edward Rose and Hugh Glass were one of the last 2 men ashore, feigning away with their rifles, covering the retreat of the men swimming to the boats. Hugh Glass then turned to the river and started towards the boats under a shower of bullets and arrows, with Ed Rose covering his retreat. Ed Rose then turned and retreated to the boats. The Arikara warriors then stormed the beach, firing on those in the water. But both Glass and Rose made it aboard safely, and the boatmen were able to get Ashley's boat free from the sandbar and then drift downstream. The other boat that was positioned on the opposite bank cut its anchor cable and followed Ashley's boat downstream. Just 15 minutes after the first shot, it is believed that 12 to 14 of Ashley's men were killed, with 11 wounded. Hugh Glass was one of those wounded, shot in the leg. The Arikara warriors lost an estimated 5 to 8 warriors. Ashley wrote in a report that he did not understand why the party was taken by such surprise, but it is easy to speculate that the heavy rain of that evening gave a screen for the warriors to get in place. Ashley's party then came ashore, far downriver from the Arikara village to take in what happened. 3 more men had perished on the trip downriver, bleeding out from their wounds. There is a legend that Ashley wanted to create an armored boat full of men to travel past the Arikara villages, but many of the trappers refused so he considered other plans. Ashley wrote a letter to the United States Army at Fort Atkinson, and a letter to St. Louis asking for more men and sent it downstream on the Yellowstone packet, along with the wounded men and the men who had resigned from the job after seeing what the Untamed West was really like. Hugh Glass also sent a letter on the boat as well, to the father of a fallen comrade, John Gardner. Fortunately, it was saved and turned over to the South Dakota Historical Society. It is the only piece of Hugh's handwriting that has survived time. This has led many to believe that Hugh Glass was illiterate, but this is not the case. This note will also be linked in the show notes. The note reads, quote, "Dear Sir, my painful duty is to tell you of the death of your son, who befell at the hands of the Indians, 2D June, in the early morning. He lived a little while after he was shot, and asked me to inform you of his sad fate. We brought him to the ship when he soon died. Mr. Smith, a young man of our company, made powerful prayer, who moved us greatly, and I am persuaded John died in peace. His body we buried with others near this camp, and marked the grave with log. His sayings we will send to you. The savages are greatly treacherous. We traded with them as friends, but after a great storm of rain and thunder, they came to us before light, and many were hurt. I myself was shot in the leg. Master Ashley is bound to stay in these parts, till the traitors are right punished. Your humble servant, Hugh Glass." The young man who gave a powerful prayer, Mr. Smith, was the biblical traveler Jedediah Smith. Jedediah Smith came east with word from Major Henry to General Ashley. Now, General Ashley was sending him and one other man back to Major Henry, with word to join him with every man he had available that didn't need to be held back to keep the Blackfeet from taking over their newly established fort. News of the ambush of the Missouri Fur Company and General Ashley's party reached Fort Atkinson at different times. At this time in history, Fort Atkinson, which was located on the modern-day Nebraska side of the Missouri River, was the only post charged with policing the central and northern plains, as well as the Rockies and whatever lay beyond them. It was manned by the 6th Infantry, which, during the War of 1812, they earned the nickname the Regulars. But at this time, it was a skeleton crew of what it had once been. In charge of the fort was Lieutenant Colonel Henry Leavenworth. Leavenworth's approach to the challenge of policing the West was one of calculated detachment. He had essentially adopted a policy of leaving the tribes to their own devices, intervening only when their actions threatened to disrupt the fragile settlements that were slowly encroaching on their ancestral lands. The government, it seemed, had little appetite for their involvement in the complex web of intertribal affairs, turning a blind eye even when the occasional white man fell victim to the violence that occasionally flared up between the various nations. But when 3 reports that were placed on Leavenworth's desk appeared in May and June, he could not ignore them. The first was the 4 men of Major Henry's party that were killed by the Blackfeet. The second was the 7 Missouri Fur Company men that were also killed by the Blackfeet. And the third was the battle between the Arikaras and Ashley's party. On the 22nd of July, 250 soldiers from the 6th Infantry left from Fort Atkinson on several boats carrying, quote, the 6 infantry companies, their commissionary and ordnance supplies, 2 6-pounders, and several light cannon mounted on swivels. William Ashley was still hell-bent on getting even with the Arikara, but most of the men had either dropped or lost their rifles during the rush to escape to the boats. James Clyman did just that. He dropped it in the river when he found it too heavy to swim with. However, Hugh Glass did not lose his coveted rifle. He loved that damn rifle. Then Ashley had thought of the horses. He lost them all. The ones that weren't killed during the attack were then rounded up by the Arikara after the battle. He then thought of his opponent. He wrote, quote, the Rickaries are about 600 warriors, armed with London fusiliers, which carry a ball with considerable accuracy and force. If the party did not get help from the army, from Major Henry, and from the men that were hopefully coming back from dropping off the wounded, they would not be able to fight the Arikara. The party is only said to have 30 members. Ashley's party did not know if their cries for help were being answered or not, for they hadn't received any word. But work was being done to provide help to the heavily outnumbered trappers. Major Henry led 50 of his men south from Fort Henry, leaving 20 men behind to guard the fort from any native war parties. Included in these 20 was Wounded Knee's Potts. Another 80 men joined Henry's party. Included in this was 40 men from the Missouri Fur Company that were willing to fight the Arikaras. And the other 40 were labeled, quote, dinky firms and border drifters. Essentially, men that were not part of any outfit, just drifters of the West. Recognizing the need for more manpower to take on the formidable Arikara, Joseph Pilcher, the Missouri Fur Company's leader, decided to seek reinforcements from the Sioux tribe, who were sworn enemies of the Arikara. Pilcher informed the Sioux that the, quote, Great White Father, which was a common term referring to the President of the United States, or the American government, was advancing upon the Arikara, and the Sioux responded with enthusiasm, contributing around 400 of their own fierce warriors to the cause. The Sioux also promised that other bands of their tribe would join in the fight against their rivals, demonstrating the complex web of alliances and rivalries between the various Native American groups in the region. As Henry's party journeyed onward, their numbers swelled with each passing mile, as more and more warriors joined their cause. The group had grown into an impressive force of nearly 1,000 strong, a formidable sight to behold as they made their way downriver, some traveling by boat, others riding horseback, and the rest marching on foot towards the awaiting general. The arrival of this sizable contingent must have filled General Ashley's men with a profound sense of relief and renewed vigor, knowing that they now had the backing of 250 fellow soldiers, as well as a staggering 750 Sioux and 130 experienced trappers, all poised and ready to enter the fray. It is unclear whether Hugh Glass was part of the second battle between the trappers and the Arikara. You'll see in some reports that he was still healing from his wounds, but others will say that he was. My belief is that he was part of the second piece of this Arikara war, and therefore I will be telling his story as if he was, but keep in mind that he may not have been there at all. But again, this detail is confusing with credible sources on both sides. Maybe it's me having a little bias of wanting him to be there, because it adds to the legend, but again, I'm not stating this out of fact. If you have more info on this detail, please email me and let me know your thoughts. Regardless, the two villages they would be facing lay across the west bank of the mighty Missouri River. One situated just below the Cottonwood Creek containing 70 lodges, the other perched above the creek with 71 lodges. This was no small force they were up against, but with their ranks now bolstered, the men knew they were more than prepared to take on the challenge. Their weapons freshly rearmed and their spirits reinvigorated, they were ready for the impending battle that lay ahead. On the 9th of August, Leavenworth's army began the action. As the Arikaras dashed out to meet their enemies, skirmishing between the Arikaras and the combination of the army, Sioux warriors, and fur trappers took place. The 6th Infantry made to advance, but couldn't fire upon the Arikara because the Dakotas, another word for the Sioux, stood between them and their targets. Seeing the volume of force their enemy had, the Arikaras retreated to the protection of their villages. The Sioux were eager to attack the villages, and their war whoops grew louder and louder. The officers and the men of the 6th wished the same. They traveled long and hard, and they wanted that travel to be worth the hardship. The fur trappers were in as well. They were ready to avenge the men who were killed at the hands of the Arikara, and they wanted it now. Pilcher put it best when he said, quote, "A decisive blow is indispensable for the safety of every white man on the river above the Council Bluffs." The scene was set for a decisive clash between American and Sioux men and the Arikara villages. The men were positioned in a semicircle formation, with both ends reaching the river and spanning the width of the two Arikara villages. On the right flank, Hugh Glass and the rest of Ashley's men extended their line all the way to the river, facing the lower portion of the enemy settlement. The 6th Infantry covered the opposite flank, and legend has it that the Sioux warriors were stationed in the center of the line. Held in reserve were the Missouri Fur Company men, including Pilcher, poised to shore up any weak points in the line. Then Leavenworth gave the order, and the first artillery bombardment soon rained down upon the Arikara villages. One of the cannon shots found its mark, tragically striking the head of an Arikara chief, known as Chief Grey Eyes, as he briefly emerged from his lodge. Glass recognized the fallen chief from his previous interactions with the Pawnee tribe. Beyond the decapitation of the chief, the initial bombardment killed around 18 Arikara warriors, women, and children. The cannons continued to lob projectiles into the villages, but the sturdy Arikara lodges proved to be adequate defenses, and the bombardment ultimately caused only minimal damage. The soldiers, warriors, and trappers were eager for the assault, growing increasingly impatient with the seemingly ineffective bombardment that they were witnessing from their positions. They wanted to strike. They had to strike. The time was now. With their blood up, they knew it was only a matter of time before they were told to charge. But the attack never came. Leavenworth, the overall commander of the forces, never gave the signal to attack. He instead decided to discuss peace terms. The reason for Leavenworth's decision was one that has been discussed by historians for years. This was the very first battle between the United States military and any tribe of the Great Plains. The West was untamed land. If you remember, I mentioned that Fort Atkinson was there to stop any native tribes from sabotaging the settlements east of the Missouri, but paid little attention to things west of the river. This came out when Leavenworth thought twice about leading troops against an Indian nation without the sanction of his superior officer and the War Department. Therefore, he called off the attack and instead wanted to discuss peace. Ashley and Pilcher wanted the Arikaras to return or replace the property stolen from them, with the addition of compensating them for their lost horses and men. But at the discussion table, there was an anxiety on the surface of Leavenworth, and the Arikara chief knew it. The Arikaras then began to dictate the peace talks, instead of Leavenworth. Leavenworth knew it too. He states, quote, "Considering my small force, the strange and unaccountable conduct of the Sioux, and even the great probability of their joining the Arikaras against us, and also considering the importance of saving to our country the expense and trouble of a lone Indian warfare, I thought it proper to accept the terms." It is clear that Leavenworth did not have great knowledge of the relationship between the Sioux and the Arikara. They were bitter enemies and would rather fight than shake hands. At the end of the day, the Arikaras brought Ashley 3 rifles, 1 horse, and 16 buffalo robes, and they said that they had no more to give. The Sioux, frustrated over the Great White Father suing for peace when they outnumbered and outgunned their enemy, left camp, and to show their frustration a little more, took 6 army mules and many of Ashley's horses. The Arikaras abandoned their villages the night following the smoking of the peace pipe. Leavenworth then left with his men back to Fort Atkinson, leaving the trappers alone in the wilderness. In frustration, some of the trappers snuck across the river and set fire to the villages. After the Arikara War, that was more of a standoff between 2 powerful armies that ended in Leavenworth and the Arikara chief smoking a peace pipe, Ashley and Henry had a decision to make. They had built up huge debts with almost nothing to show for it in terms of furs, but they did have one advantage. They had men in the field, willing and able to start trapping. But their route up the Missouri was now considered closed, so they made the decision to travel overland to the west. Ashley traveled downriver to Fort Kiowa, trading some of their stored up goods for horses. When he arrived back at camp, he split up his men into 2 groups. Major Henry would lead a party of men to Fort Henry, shut it down, then move south to winter among the friendly Crow. Hugh Glass was in this party of 30 men and 6 pack horses that left in August of 1823. The Arikara War now behind him, it would prove to be the first of many near-death experiences as a mountaineer for Hugh Glass. Daniel Potts wrote that there were 30 men total in the party. Because the Arikaras and Sioux had made off with the majority of their horses, the men only had 6 horses that were being used as pack mules. The men were forced to walk through tall grass and brush. On a good day, they made 20 miles. Therefore, the men were not making the progress that the major wanted. He then made the decision to split his group. 17 men would stay behind with the pack mules. Maybe. Sources are confusing whether it was 17 or 13. But regardless, the group that stayed traveling west was led by Jedediah Smith. His goal was to reach the Crow villages and do 2 things. First, trade for horses that the party desperately needed, and second, gain knowledge of the beaver-rich region. While Major Henry would lead the 13 or 17 men in an advance party to Fort Henry. But their fort was located in hostile Blackfeet territory. James Kleiman would name 8 of the men that were in the advance party. Major Henry was one, Hugh Glass was another, then you had Hiram Allen, Moses Harris, John Fitzgerald, Jim Bridger, James Anderson, and Augusta Neal. We now know that Daniel Potts was involved in Henry's party, as he was one of the men that wrote an account of what happened during their journey. When the men set up camp for the night, had their dinner, and laid their heads down to get some much needed rest as they had been traveling hard and needed it. But when you're traveling the frontier, you never fully fall asleep. Daniel Potts writes that the group, quote, were fired on by the Mandans and Gravants in the dead hour of night. 2 men were killed and 2 wounded, along with 2 horses being labeled as lost. The 2 men killed were believed to be James Anderson and Augusta Neal. These Gravants were not the Gross Venter, that were part of the Blackfoot Confederation that were dreaded by any white man that traveled on the frontier. The longer you listen to this podcast, the more you will learn of how skilled these warriors were when it came to warfare. But these were not the Blackfeet. They instead were the normally friendly Hidatsa or Mandans. This was so unusual that this assault of Henry's party would be the only recorded incident of hostilities towards any Euro-Americans in the tribe's history according to HughGlass.org. Some historians believe that the warriors were Arikaras, but Daniel Potts and Moses Harris later recounted that they were indeed Hidatsas. Moses Harris would declare a year later after visiting a Mandan village and talk about how he recognized one of the horses that they had stolen from Henry's party. He would also write in a letter on the 7th of July, 1824. That Henry's party, quote, were fired on by the Mandans and Gravants in the dead hour of the night and killed 2 and wounded 2 more of our men. 2 guns were fired from our men and killed 1 Indian, and they retreated. Unknowingly to Henry's party, Joshua Pilcher, the head of the Missouri Fur Company, warned the Indian agent at Fort Atkinson, a man named Benjamin O'Fallon, that the Mandans and Minnetarees had become dangerously excited by the news of the recent massacre of the whites by the Arikara. This is what led them to be hostile towards Henry's party, but they soon calmed after hearing that the fur trappers had burned down the Arikara villages. With their villages being substantially smaller, they worried about their own towns and people and decided against hostility. But this was not a comforting thought to the fur trappers. Since the attack occurred during the night, when morning came, the trappers were able to see the signs. The veteran trappers could tell by the tracks and other signs of who attacked them. If the normally peaceful Hidatsas attacked them, what would the other openly hostile tribes do? Myers states in his book, quote, "Hardy frontiersmen though they were, it was a nervous group of trappers that strode on the west after putting earth above their dead. Except for Hugh Glass, that is, and possibly Black Harris. By most accounts the first, and according to one report the other, too, were as nonchalant as though they had never heard that Indians had scalping knives." Trappers' diets were simple: meat and some plants that few men knew the true properties of. But they relied heavily on fresh meat, which was rich in blood. This allowed the men to survive as the nourishment properties of blood gave them the opportunity. The issue with hunting for fresh meat is the noise that is created in order to obtain it. A gunshot is a beacon to a roaming warband on the lookout for vulnerable trappers. But without the meat, they wouldn't survive long anyways, so Henry had allowed shooting. He did, however, want to limit the amount of shooting that took place. He picked 2 men to be hunters that were to shoot at any game they could. According to James Hall, Glass was named as one of the party's scouts for game, but despite all of his experience, he was not named as one of the hunters. Now Henry had strict orders for the rest of the men who were not the hunters. They were to remain in a tight group behind him. With them traveling through hostile Indian country, he wanted his men ready to defend at a moment's notice. But this was not a military corps. These men were frontiersmen and did not always follow precise orders. Edmund Flagg wrote, quote, "The command of the leader of an expedition to the Rocky Mountains are not observed with quite the punctiliousness of a military corps, and accordingly notwithstanding the strict injunction to the contrary, 2 men, one of them named Hugh Glass, and the other George Harris, strolled off from the company unnoticed in search of wild fruit." George Harris was actually Moses Harris according to several different accounts. However, Yount and Kleiman say that Hugh Glass was the only one who refused to blend with the group. Orange Clark recounted, quote, "Glass, as was usual, could not be kept in obedience to orders with the rest, but preserved to thread his way along through the brush." Whether Hugh was alone or not, it's clear that Hugh Glass was not too happy about being left out of the hunters, and also wasn't one to conform to orders. He had already been through a lifetime full of experiences and near-death encounters. He did not need someone to tell him the best way to survive. Though Hugh is not one to follow strict orders, Orange Clark writes about Hugh, saying, quote, "He had his failings, but his fellow trappers bear testimony to his honor, integrity, and fidelity. He could be relied on, and no man would fly more swiftly, nor contribute more freely to the relief of a suffering fellow man than he." One day, Hugh Glass was walking through the dense brush along a river bottom looking for game. Suddenly, he stumbled upon a giant grizzly bear with her 2 cubs. Hugh saw her, and she saw him. The bear charged. Hugh tried to raise his rifle and he pulled the trigger, but the bear was on him in an instant. The bear grabbed him and raised him off the ground, and threw him down, tearing and slashing at Hugh's body. Hugh fought to get away, screaming for help, but old Ephraim was not letting that happen. The bear then bit Hugh and took a chunk of him. Hugh was unresponsive, laying still on the ground. The bear retired to her cubs, and this gave Hugh a chance to escape. He took it and made the effort, but just as he started, the bear was back on him, seizing him on the shoulder and almost completely tearing off Hugh's left arm. She tore at him again and inflicted a severe wound on the back of his head. Hugh Glass was now fully unconscious. Then men from the party appeared, responding from Hugh's shots and screams. The men fired on the bear that was standing over Hugh. The bear fell dead over Hugh Glass. Just another warning, this next part is going to be very graphic. According to Flag, Glass had, quote, "not less than 15 wounds, any one of which, under ordinary circumstances, would have been considered mortal." Yount recounts that Hugh had several lacerations on his scalp, face, chest, shoulder, arm, hand, thigh, and back. The worst of them being a tear that cut both sides of his throat, in which a red bubble would protrude every time the man took a breath. Lastly, Potts recalled it simply, summarizing how he looked by saying that Glass had been, quote, "torn nearly to pieces." Hugh was covered in claw lacerations, bite marks, blood, dirt. He had a broken leg, an arm that was barely attached, and looked like a man that was meaning to die before long. Now before we go further, let's discuss something that historians and people who like history, like myself, have argued about since the event took place. Did Hugh Glass kill the bear, or did he really even get a shot off at all? Well, according to Myers book, quote, "veteran frontiersmen have pointed out that it is impossible for a hunter to be utterly surprised by a grizzly. They have insisted that man could always get off a shot, because of the monster's method of fighting. The primary war tools of old Ephraim were not his teeth, but his terribly armed forepaws. In order to be able to swing these, he broke his charge and rose up on his hind legs, giving ample time in which to launch an aimed bullet." Well, there you have it. According to veteran frontiersmen, everyone had plenty of time to get a shot off. Question answered, done deal. Well, that ain't the most truthful tale. Jedediah Smith also survived a bear attack in the fall of 1823. James Kleiman, the man who would stitch Dye back together, recounted, quote, "while passing through a brushy bottom, a large grizzly came down the valley. We being in single file, men on foot leading pack horses, he struck us about the center. Then turning, ran parallel to our line. Cap Smith being in the advance, ran to the open ground, and as he emerged from the thicket, he and the bear met face to face. Grizzly did not hesitate a moment, but sprung on the Cap, taking him by the head, first pitching, sprawling on the earth. Here's an example of how veteran frontiersmen saw the bear, and no one got off a shot. Then the bear is on top of Smith in a flash, and everyone is panicking. Also, I'm a hunter. I've been in the woods plenty, and though I've never encountered a grizzly face to face, I've heard countless stories of bears appearing in camp without making a sound, or them appearing out of nowhere while walking through the woods. I'd like to think I could react in time and defend myself, but in reality, I don't know what I would do if I came face to face with a 600-pound grizzly. Now, that being said, I do believe Hugh Glass was able to get off a shot, but how accurate this shot was, and how much damage, if any, it actually did, is hard to find. But there are several accounts of the men that responded to Hugh's screams and his gunshot. So I do believe that Glass was able to get a shot off, but I do not believe it was the one that killed the bear. It could possibly be that the shot wounded the bear enough that it would die eventually, but it was able to attack Hugh 2 different times before being killed by the responding men. What are your thoughts on the whole deal? Did Hugh get off a shot? Did he kill the bear? Email me, wildwestdeepdives@gmail.com. Now let's get back to the story. Hugh Glass was in such bad shape that most of the men believed he'd be dead by nightfall. He was barely breathing, and every time he did, a bubble would appear from his throat. He was covered in lacerations and bite marks. These men had no medical supplies. The best they could provide was roughly covering his wounds and hope for the best. The men made camp and made Hugh as comfortable as possible and waited for him to go to the other side. But Hugh Glass was a tough man. Come sunup the following morning, Glass was still breathing, though barely, but each gasp for air was followed by another. Andrew Henry knew that they couldn't stay for long. They had to keep moving. They were in hostile native country. The men then built a litter. It was a frontier stretcher of sorts made out of some tree branches, and placed Hugh upon it, carrying him for 2 days as they made slow progress to the fort. Too slow for Andrew Henry. A decision needed to be made, a damn tough decision. Could Henry risk the lives of all of his men, for a man that they figured would be dead soon anyways? This is when Henry made the decision to leave 2 men behind, to see Glass through, while the rest would travel on. Though Henry asked for volunteers, as he could not bring himself to appoint anyone to this job, knowing the danger it would be. Cook reported that Henry offered $80 to each man who would stay to see Hugh through. $80 then is about $2,500 today. That may not sound very appealing for a job that would mean camping in hostile territory, protecting a man that you thought would have died a few days ago, but was still clinging to life. But remember, these are the same men that signed up for $200 a year, about $6,500 today. Therefore, that may have seemed like a nice chunk of change. Regardless, there was no rush of volunteers. The men knew the danger that lay in waiting for a man to die in hostile territory. But eventually, 2 men volunteered. Flagg reported that the first was a Fitzgerald, and the last was an unnamed youngster of 17 named Bridges, which many believed to be the young Jim Bridger. The Fitzgerald that Flagg reported was John Fitzgerald. Henry's party left the men with some supplies, then headed out on their way to Fort Henry. As Edmund Flagg put it, quote, "This arrangement was undoubtedly, under the circumstances of this case, the most merciful and considerate which could have been adopted. But what a situation! A man languishing under 15 frightful wounds, thousands of miles from all surgical succor, surrounded by roving savages, almost destitute of the necessaries of existence, and in the care of 2 lawless men whose interest it was that their patient should, as soon as possible, cease to live." The 2 men left to care for Hugh figured he would die in the coming days. They could then rejoin the party quickly, with a few more dollars in their pockets. But Hugh Glass was no ordinary man. After several days, Glass was still holding on, and the men protecting him began to get more and more nervous. The longer they waited for Glass to die, the further the party traveled away from them, and the higher the chances got that a native war party would appear eager for their scalps. According to Young, Fitzgerald and Bridger waited 4 days. James Hall said 5, and Flagg said 6. The exact number is unknown. That being said, the men had finally made the decision. According to Meyer's book, quote, "It was the man, and not the boy, who cracked first." If speechless, Glass could hear, and he told Yount as much, together with some of the arguments Fitzgerald used in urging Bridger to cave. He went on to say more, stating, quote, "He declared that sacrificing their own lives would not float that of a man whom they both knew to be halfway down the deep 6. The men left Glass with nothing. At Fitzgerald's leadership, they took anything of use to them that could be useful in a survival situation. His flint and steel, his tomahawk, knife, sidearm, ammo, powder, percussion caps, but most importantly, they took his rifle. Hugh Glass was now alone, barely alive, taking life one breath at a time. He obviously had a strong will to survive, but now he had a new fire burning inside him for survival. He loved that damn rifle, and now it was in the hands of a man that would abandon a wounded comrade. The fire burned bright to get his rifle back, but also to get revenge on the men who left him abandoned. He wouldn't die. He had to find a way to survive, and he would do just that. He struggled with fever and delirium for the first few days. He later told Young that he had wolves take his buffalo robe that the men left draped over him, but he wasn't sure if it was true or just a dream. But the men did leave him close to a stream, in reach of water and also buffalo berries that he could crush to a pulp in order to drink. He would drink some water and the pulp from the berries, throw it up, pass out, awake, and repeat. He did this for several days, until he finally gained the strength to begin crawling. As he crawled, he came across a rattlesnake that had just finished a fairly large meal. He was able to grab a rock and kill the rattlesnake. Though he could not eat a solid mass of food, his throat was too badly damaged and had not healed. Therefore, he grinded the meat between two stones. Then with each bit of snake, would mix it with a mouthful of water to create a sort of cold stew so he could get the nourishment he needed. Though Flagg did mention that Hugh may have had a small brass kettle that Fitzgerald and Bridger did not bother taking. Both Flagg and Cook mentioned that Hugh may have also had an old straight razor that could have helped in skinning the snake. He was slowly gaining strength. Though he couldn't stand to walk, he was able to crawl at a faster pace now. But he was roughly 250 miles from the nearest fort, Fort Kiowa. He had one piece of equipment when he began his expedition. He left behind the kettle as it was too difficult to travel with. All he had was a straight razor. Also something to remember, he wasn't traveling in perfect conditions. This was hostile native country, and also, clearly, grizzly country. He was at risk of these dangers on a daily basis. Then you add in the fact that it was wintertime with low temperatures, freezing cold winds, and snow. These conditions only made it harder for a wounded Glass. He survived the next while on insects, berries, anything he could scrounge up on his journey. He had learned a lot from his time with the Pawnee. This was knowledge he was using to the fullest intent now. Which berries were edible, which were poisonous, which plants were helpful, which were hurtful. Hugh would come across a dead buffalo carcass, its meat picked clean by whatever killed it, and the other scavengers like Glass in the area. But the bone marrow was still accessible. He could crack the bones, take the marrow, mix it with the berries and other plants he had found, and make it into an ingestible form of nourishment. It may not sound very good, but this was giving vital nourishment to keep Glass moving forward. Then Glass made a lifeline find. He stumbled upon a pack of wolves that were feasting on a freshly killed buffalo calf. This was not only life-saving, but would give him the strength he needed to be able to gain the strength in order to walk. The several accounts of Glass's life agree that he was able to get the buffalo calf in his possession, but how he got it is a different story. There are some accounts that say Glass was able to start a fire and it drove the wolves away. However, Glass had a straight razor, and that was it. Could he have used a rock and a straight razor to create a spark? Maybe, but as you will learn, it's unlikely. Other accounts say that Glass grabbed a stick and had his razor and created a lot of noise and thrashing in order to scare the wolves off. But Hugh couldn't stand. A man walking towers over wolves and could make a more scary target. But Hugh was crawling. He was on the same level of the wolves, and if they decided to attack, they would have finished old Ephraim's work. It is most likely that Glass let the wolves have their fill and then moved in when they were done. He could have possibly scared him off at this time though. A full-bellied wolf is far less aggressive than a hungry one. However it happened, Glass now had the calf in his possession and began eating the buffalo meat raw. If he had the ability to make fire, as stated by some Glass historians, we can imagine he would have cooked it now. Or, he was so hungry and desperate for meat that he didn't care to cook it. Regardless, he would stay put and feast on this calf for several days, slowly gaining his strength. Some reports even state that he made sort of a shelter from the hide of the buffalo, but again, it is not a for sure fact. Glass, now strengthened by the buffalo calf, was able to stand upright and walk. He could now watch for hostile natives, bears, and other predators and finally see what lay ahead of him. He could finally defend himself. Though he still had no weapons, he did have a heavy stick, but it was better than nothing. His pace did quicken with the help from the stick, as his leg dragged behind. Though some of his wounds were healing at a fast rate, his back wounds were causing some problems because of infection. There are reports that the wounds were covered in maggots, which would actually be a good thing, as gross as that is. They state that he learned this way of healing from his time spent with the Pawnee, to where someone could lean up against a dead tree stump and let the maggots eat away at the dead, infected flesh, therefore cleaning the wounds and allowing for proper healing to begin. Is this true? Nobody really knows. It was hard for me to find cold, hard evidence on whether this was practiced by the Pawnee tribe, or whether Glass purposely used the maggots as a healing agent. Regardless, Glass was making his way at a much better pace, with one thing on his mind: a fire that burned inside him and kept him warm. Vengeance. While on his journey, he suddenly heard horse hooves close by. Was it a native war party? Was it friendly trappers? Glass did not know. As the party approached, they noticed the shape in which Glass was in. He was slowly limping his way towards them, accepting the fate of whatever lay ahead of him. But it turns out, it was a friendly band of Sioux Indians. These Sioux were not a traveling war party looking for scalps, but a raiding party that were traveling to possibly conduct a raid on the nearby Arikara villages. The Sioux noticed the dire situation Glass was in and came to assist him. They gently placed him on horseback and took him back to their village, where they cleaned his wounds and cared for him. The Sioux were longtime friends of the fur trappers. If you remember, they fought side by side in the Arikara War. Though war would be a strong word for the events that took place. Go give episode 2 a listen if you haven't done so. After helping Glass with his wounds and giving him his first few quality meals since the attack, the Sioux gave Glass a bull boat, which is essentially a small skiff wrapped in buffalo skin. It's sometimes the size of a canoe, sometimes smaller. But they gave him one of these, and he was able to float downriver to his destination, Fort Kiowa. Fort Kiowa was the location to which William Ashley's party traveled to. It was a vital fort for the fur trade at the time, and sort of a jumping off and resupply point for many trappers. There, he could get the necessary supplies needed to travel to Yellowstone Country, to Fort Henry, and confront Fitzgerald and Bridger. Glass traveled the remainder of the Grand River, about 9 miles to where it ran into the Missouri River, in which he would travel down to the fort. Around 1.5 months after the bear attack, Hugh Glass arrived at Fort Kiowa. He had traveled 250 miles through hostile Indian country, filled with grizzly bears with nothing but a straight razor and a burning desire for vengeance. I think it's easy to assume that any man that had just gone through what Glass had would have taken a little rest, got some food, some quality sleep, let the old body recover for a while. But Glass was no ordinary man. No, he got some supplies on credit because he was an quote-unquote Ashley man. He got a rifle, some powder, and other necessary supplies, and joined up with some French voyageurs that were headed up the Missouri to the Mandan villages. Glass had a check-in with some fellows about a rifle, and he wasn't in the mood to sit around and wait. The man who headed this expedition was named Antoine Sido, who went by Langevin, and I know for a fact I'm saying all of that incorrectly. My apologies. But Langevin led the party, and they headed out just a couple days after Glass arrived, with Glass in tow. There were possibly 6 as many as 8 men aboard the expedition to the Mandan villages. The men were traveling upriver in their hand-powered craft and arrived at Seminole Island on the 15th of October, 1823. This is the first date to where we have actual documentation of when all of Glass's travel took place. Langevin had made his last will and testament on the island and dated it October 15th. Therefore, historians can make a pretty solid guess that they left Fort Kiowa on the 11th of October. Once they left the island, travel became slower and harder with each passing day. This was late October, and they were not only traveling upriver, but dealing with freezing cold winds that blew in their face and caused ice-cold waves to crash into their bow. Glass had had enough. They were traveling too slow for his liking, and he decided to leave the French voyageurs and travel afoot, overland to Fort Henry. He felt he could travel faster walking than he could rowing a small craft upstream in these conditions, and that decision saved his life. After Glass went ashore, the French voyageurs went back to their hard river travel. When just a few miles in, The sound of current and wind gave way to hundreds of rifles and arrows piercing through the air in a thrill of war cries. In return, there was a few gunshots from the French voyagers. The warriors rushed forward and finished them off with their tomahawks and war clubs. The French voyagers were massacred at the hands of the Arikara. It's a tad bit confusing that the Arikaras were hostile, as they made peace with the Palefaces shortly after the Arikara War. The Arikara had moved their camp just a mile south of the Mandan villages, and had been peaceful with the Palefaces. But there was a small group of Arikaras that did not want peace, and it is believed that this was the group that killed these voyagers. Glass's life was spared, not at the choice of the Arikaras though. In almost every account, Glass was miles away from the attack, but he did not travel much farther than that before he stumbled upon his own band of Arikaras. Edmund Flagg writes, quote, "He proceeded but a few miles when he came upon a roving band of Arikara Indians, who chanced to have their encampment in a party of them. As soon as he was perceived, gave chase, evidently with hostile designs. The Arikaras were getting on him fast, and it looked like he was going to be slaughtered and scalped. But an Indian from the Mandan tribe, most likely a scout, saw Glass's situation, and put his life on the line to pick up Glass and escort him to safety." George C. Young and James Hall wrote similar accounts in that some Arikara squaws were out gathering firewood when they saw Hugh and alerted the nearby warriors, and then he had 2 Mandans rescuing him. Regardless, when Glass arrived in the safety of the Mandan villages, he learned of the massacre of the voyagers. Glass once again survives a couple near-death encounters. This next part is just for fun, as it is most likely completely untrue, and it's just a legend. But it comes from John Myers' book, and talks about the account of Lieutenant Philip St. George Cook, whose work on Hugh Glass as a whole had to be looked at closely, because he heard a lot of hearsay and accounts from other people. Anyways, here we go. As the voyagers went back to river travel, Glass had just left them, and had not traveled far when the gunfire started. Glass was able to hide in the thick bottomland brush and was not seen. Cook writes, it's a long quote, but it tells of the bloody encounter. Quote, "Like the hunted fox, he doubled, he turned, ran, or crawled, successfully gaining the various concealments of the dense bottom to increase his distance from the bloody scene. And such was his success, that he had thought himself nearly safe, when at a slight opening he was suddenly faced by a foe. It was an Arikara scout. So close were these wily woodsmen, that but the one had scarce time to use a weapon intended for a much greater distance. The deadly tomahawk of the other was the most readily substituted for the steeled arrow. At this instant, it flew through the air, and the rifle was discharged. Neither could see or feel the effect produced, but they rushed to each other's grasp, either endeavoring to crush his adversary by the shock of the onset. But Glass, not wholly recovered from his wounds, was doomed to sink beneath the superior strength of his adversary. By an irresistible effort of which he was rolled upon the earth, the Indian above. They tugged, they strained, down they go, the gale above, Fitzjames below. And here Hugh's career would probably have closed. But that in truth, it seemed that he bore a charmed existence. At this instant, the effect of his unerring shot developed. The Indian's last convulsion exertion, so successful, was accompanied by a shout of victory, but expiring on his lips, it marked his soul's departure. Redeemed, unhoped, from death, Glass beheld at his feet his late enemy, not only dead, but already stiffening, with one hand instinctively touching the hilt of his knife. Did this actually happen? Probably not. The first being, if there was a whole village of Arikaras attacking the craft, then just after the main battle, a gunshot is fired and a fight ensues, it's safe to assume some of the village would have responded. Also, there are many more accounts of Glass being many miles away and not hearing of the battle until arriving at the Mandan village. Glass was now in the Mandan village, and they became fascinated by the stories of how Glass has survived. His encounter with the Grizzly, and the story of his journey to Fort Kiowa, then him avoiding being massacred and rescued by 1 or 2 Mandan braves, the story of Glass was spreading through the plains, between natives and white men alike. Glass had been involved in 3 separate Indian attacks, where 21 of his companions had been killed and 16 of them wounded. Myers writes, quote, "Signs which had earlier stirred the curiosity of the red and white men met by Glass at Fort Kiowa and the intervening post. While the wounds given him by old Ephraim were still in the process of healing, the man who met a bear began to be the talk of the plains. An interest in him deepened when the grapevine began spreading tales of how he'd again played the greased pig that death couldn't hold." But Glass was an impatient man. The region was crawling with hostile Arikara, Blackfeet, Assiniboine, as well as other dangers such as wild animals and the weather itself. Remember, this is the middle of winter. But under the cover of darkness, Glass snuck away from the village and resumed his quest for vengeance. On roughly the 20th of November, Glass arrived at Fort Tilton. He didn't stay long though, and was back on his way for his encounter with Fitzgerald and Bridger. But what Glass didn't know was that Fitzgerald and a couple other men from Ashley's company were floating down the Missouri and arrived at Fort Tilton just a few days after he had left. There is a legend that this is when these men learned that Glass was not dead, and it must have sent chills down the spine of Fitzgerald. The men were traveling downriver to Fort Atkinson, but Glass was traveling upriver. This leg of his journey was about 300 miles, with high winds and low temperatures as his only company. Although the travel was rough and difficult, it was uneventful, sort of a surprise with what we have learned about Hugh Glass so far. Cook sums it up by stating, quote, "In 2 weeks, he reached the mouth of the Yellowstone, having met with neither white man or Indian. He crossed the Missouri on a raft, made of 2 logs tied together with bark." After 300 miles of hard travel, Glass finally arrived at Fort Henry, though he did not know that Fitzgerald wasn't there. We can imagine what he must have been thinking. His quest for vengeance was almost complete. He would get his rifle back, and he would make good on his word against the 2 men that robbed him and left him to die at his biggest moment of need. But as Glass approached the fort, he realized that it was abandoned. Major Henry had created a new Fort Henry about 250 miles further into the unknown. Legend is that Henry may have left a note of some sort about the whereabouts of the new fort, and that's how Glass knew where to go, as during the winter there was no way for him to follow a trail of the fort. But regardless of that, he had to travel an additional 250 miles through unknown winter wilderness and hostile Indian country. Meanwhile, the new Fort Henry was celebrating the passing of 1823. The trappers were sharing drinks and stories of the year and preparing for 1824. When a ghost came walking through their fort. Hugh Glass arrived at the new Fort Henry. The trappers could not believe their eyes. The man they believed to be dead was standing in front of them. Besides some physical changes after his battle with old Ephraim, Hugh Glass was there, in the flesh, and he had one thing on his mind. Where were the 2 men that left him for dead? This is when he learned that Fitzgerald wasn't there, but Jim Bridger was. Finally, the time had come. He was face to face with the man that he had traveled over 1,200 miles to confront. What would he do? Would he make him beg for his life? Answer for the sin of leaving a defenseless man to die alone in the wilderness? A fear set into Jim Bridger, knowing he'd have to answer for the sins he has committed. The feeling of guilt he no doubt felt abandoning a desperate man in a desperate situation. He'd have to answer to the man himself, and when the time came, we can imagine a teenage Jim Bridger was more than nervous. Jim Bridger and Hugh Glass were now face to face. Glass looks at Bridger and states, quote, "Young man, it is Glass that is before you. The same that, not content with leaving, you thought to a cruel death upon the prairie. You robbed, helpless as he was, of his rifle, his knife, of all with which he could hope to defend or save himself from famishing in the desert. In case I had died, you left me to despair worse than death, with no being to close my eyes. I swore an oath that I would be revenged on you and the wretch who is with you, and I ever thought to have kept it. For this meeting I have braved the dangers of a long journey. This has supported me in my weary path through the prairie. For this have I crossed raging rivers. But I cannot take your life. I see you repent. You have nothing to fear from me. Go, you are free. For your youth, I forgive you." Glass had decided that Jim Bridger was not the man at fault. He was just a young kid being influenced by the older, more experienced Fitzgerald. The quote you heard was Cook's account. There is another account by Jon that is shorter, but is roughly the same. Glass told Bridger, quote, "I leave you to the punishment of your own conscience and your God. If they forgive you, then be happy. I have nothing to say to you. But don't forget hereafter that the truth and fidelity are too valuable to be trifled with." Whether Cook's or Jon's account is the accurate one, Glass forgave Bridger. His quest for vengeance was more focused on the veteran trapper, the man who knew better than to leave behind a man that was cleaning for life. Glass wanted Fitzgerald. But Glass would have to wait as winter had set in hard at the fort, and there was no way to travel, even for Glass. There were two other parties of Ashley men that were also forced to hold travel because of the winter conditions. The first was that led by Jedediah Smith, in which Edward Rose was the guide, and were wintering among the crows on the Wind River. The second was a party sent out by Major Henry just after they began construction on their new fort. Daniel Wounded Knees Potts was a member of this expedition. He writes of a near-death encounter, writing, quote, "From thence we moved our course from the mouth of the Little Horn, and by the way I was closely pursued by a party of Indians on horseback, whom I took to be Blackfeet, and nearly made my escape by hiding in a little brush. And they came close that I could see the very whites of their eyes, which was within 5 yards. From thence I started with 7 others a trapping across the Rocky Mountains. At the commencement of winter, we started for the Columbia Mountain, to winter with the Crow Indians, who are our only friends in this country." This expedition is said to be led by Etime Provost. By some accounts, Provost wasn't even an Ashley man, but a veteran of the mountains. But I will say, it isn't verified exactly who the leader was. Regardless, this party was to find a usable pass through the mountains. Ashley and Henry had decided the only way that they would find success in these mountains was beyond the territory of the Blackfeet. Their goal was to trap the beaver-rich regions of the Great Basin. Some historians have said that both parties wintered among the Friendly Crow, the reason being that the expedition's journey led in that direction. Myers states, quote, "Logic says that its members rode along the Bighorn to that stream's tributary, the Wind. Although, it is more likely that they both hold up with the Crow, but with different bands and not in the same village, as neither James Kleiman or Potts, who provided vital information on these mountain men encounters, travel, etc., and neither mentioned staying with any other party but their own." Quick note on Jedediah Smith's party, and we will get back to Hugh Glass, I promise. But the party mistook a February thaw as the breaking of winter, which nearly killed them. As they were traveling trying to penetrate the Tetons, a blizzard rolled in and covered the party as they hunkered down and tried their best to survive. Luckily, the expedition made it through, but it was another reminder that Mother Nature cares for nobody and is more dangerous than any native warband. But before long, winter let up, and it gave Hugh Glass the opportunity to pick up his chase once again. Henry wished to send an urgent message to Ashley. What the message was about is lost to history, but it can be guessed that it was about updating him on the new fort, asking for supplies, and his decision to send a party to the Great Basin. Henry believed he needed 4 members to travel to lower Missouri. They would deal with some winter conditions as winter hadn't completely gave way to spring. And as always, they were traveling through hostile native country. Myers writes, quote, "At the time of the arrival of Glass at the fort, some individuals were sought for in the party by Major Henry to take an express of great importance to General Ashley, then at the post of Council Bluffs, several hundred miles down the Missouri. Although a great reward had been offered, none of the company had expressed willingness to undertake a passage through a region infested by wandering hostile Indians at such an inclement season. But no sooner was the enterprise proposed to Glass than he, at once, acceded to the terms, and he started on the journey with 4 others, who volunteered to accompany him by the way of the Platte. The 4 men that traveled with Glass were named by the St. Louis Inquirer as Chapman, Moore, Marsh, and Dunton. James Hall writes that the group traveled the Powder River to the Yellowstone. When they reached the Platte River, they constructed skin boats to travel to Fort Atkinson. A skin boat is the same as a bull boat, just a floating craft wrapped in furs. I didn't really mention it before, but these skin boats or bull boats were a vital piece of travel in the West. They were simple but effective. Their shallow draft made them perfect for the streams and creeks they would travel. It seems the men took the southern route of the Northern Platte River instead of the northern route of the Missouri River. Real quick, the Missouri River runs on a northern route through modern-day northern Montana, North Dakota, then heads south, as the Northern Platte runs through modern-day southwest Wyoming into Nebraska to Fort Atkinson. This was land in which Glass was familiar with, as these were the roaming and hunting grounds of the Pawnee. And after traveling in a few days, they came upon a native village. The villagers invited them ashore, and the men accepted the invitation. They left behind their rifles and one man. This man was Dutton. The other 3 men went into the village, and I'm sure were excited for their rest and some square meals. But as the men sat down and talked to the men of the village, Hugh noticed something. These men were not Pawnee. They were pronouncing some words in a different way. Though their languages were very similar, Glass could tell that these men were Arikaras. Hugh looked at his companions and stated, quote, "These are piccaries." The men waited for the right opportunity, and when the time was right, the men dashed to their boat. The men sprinted to their boat, with the Arikaras giving chase. They had no chance to fight back. Their only chance was to make it to their boat and get their weapons. But Dutton, after hearing the gunfire, rowed the bull boat to the opposite bank, figuring the men had been slaughtered. But before the men even got to the bank, 2 men were killed, Moore and Chapman. One of them right next to Glass. Marsh was able to jump in the river and swim to the other bank, meeting back up with Dutton, and now armed, continued running from the battlefield. But Glass used his experience of border warfare and found an area and some rocks where he would be well hidden, and stayed there until the Arikaras finally gave up on their search for the men. Marsh and Dutton were armed and had no problem finding meat and food on the rest of their journey to Fort Atkinson. When they arrived, they told of the trick pulled by the Arikaras on the men that resulted in the deaths of at least 2 of their party. On the 7th of June, 1824, the St. Louis Inquirer printed an article stating, quote, "Mr. Vasquez, just from the upper Missouri, states that 5 men of Major Henry's party, in descending the Platte, were attacked by a party of Arikara Indians, and that 3, Moore, Chapman, and Glass were killed. That the others, Dutton and Marsh, made their escape and arrived at Council Bluffs." Mr. Vasquez was an Ashley man, who must have heard this story from Dutton or Marsh, who believed Glass to be dead. But as we know, Glass was alive and doing a whole lot better than he was when he got attacked by old Ephraim. Glass would later recount to James Hall, stating, quote, "Although I had lost my rifle and my plunder, I felt quite rich when I found my knife, flint, and steel in my shot pouch. These little fixins make a man feel right pert when he is 300 or 400 miles from anybody or any place." Though he didn't have his rifle, he did have other important supplies. He could make fire, he had a knife, which is a hell of a lot better than a straight razor, and he did not have to rely on maggots to help him heal. He was doing pretty well compared to the last time he was alone in the unforgiving wilderness. Glass still had a job to do. He had to get a letter to General Ashley, but his route on the Platte River was not an option. Without a firearm, river travel was tempting death. Though Glass seemed he was immune to a 6-foot grave, he would do what he could to avoid it. He instead would travel by foot to Fort Kiowa, about a 400-mile journey. It was farther up the Missouri than Fort Atkinson. Fort Atkinson was roughly a 600-mile journey. Therefore, he could get to Fort Kiowa, then float downriver to Fort Atkinson. Although Glass had a job to do of delivering the letter, his own mission still burned hot, finding Fitzgerald and getting his rifle back. His journey to Fort Kiowa was rather uneventful, and after roughly 15 days according to James Hall, Glass arrived at Fort Kiowa. This is when he learned, possibly via information told by Moses Harris, that John Fitzgerald was at Fort Atkinson. It isn't clear exactly how, but we can imagine he got on a boat or built one if he had to. But sometime in June 1824, Hugh Glass walked into Fort Atkinson, hell-bent on a meeting with John Fitzgerald. He began asking around to where Fitzgerald was, and soon found out. Glass learned that John Fitzgerald was now serving in the United States Army. Glass went to an officer of the fort, said to be Captain Bennett Riley, and demanded to see Fitzgerald. He left him for dead, took all of his property, and his damned rifle. He was due for a beating, and Glass would be the one to give it to him. But the captain told Glass what he did not want to hear. John Fitzgerald was a soldier in the U.S. Army. Therefore, he was property of the United States government, and Glass could do him no harm. Although we can be sure that Glass would have loved to put a beating on Fitzgerald, Captain Riley gave Glass his rifle back, along with $300, which is about $9,700 today. Was it the ending to his over 2,000-mile journey to get his vengeance on Fitzgerald that Glass wanted? Probably not. But, as Myers states, quote, once he had his pet rifle in his hands again, he bore no one a grudge, swearing Riley was a good fellow. He shook his hand and stored contently forth. Glass, reunited with his rifle and $300 in his pocket, moved into a new chapter of his life. One would think that a man that had gone through what Glass had gone through would choose to finally settle down, after getting captured by the pirates, escaping and damn near getting sacrificed by the Pawnee, but instead, learning thousands of years of knowledge in survival, hunting, and combat tactics, then getting wounded during the Arikara War, and finally, getting attacked by a bear, being left alone, and taken on a 2,000-mile journey in order to get his rifle back, you would think a man would settle down. But his flag writes, quote, a trading party was formed to go to Santa Fe, and with it went Glass. One of the main reasons Glass went away from the upper Missouri was that Ashley and Henry's men seemed to lose a scalp for every fur obtained. Obviously, this was not a recipe for success. They weren't the only company to struggle either. William P. Tilton was forced to shut down their posts and take refuge among the Mandans, and Pilcher's Missouri Fur Company was headed towards bankruptcy. Therefore, Glass made the decision to head south to Santa Fe. Up until 1824, the Santa Fe Trail was mainly traveled by pack mules, but in 1824, merchants began traveling with wagons loaded with supplies that they would trade in Mexico. These wagons were loaded with items the market craved: silverware, textiles, leatherwork, tinware, cheaply made goods that were being mass-produced in the United States. The Queen City of the Trails, as people came to calling Independence, Missouri, was a jumping-off point for travelers to the west, and people traveling the Santa Fe Trail would start there and travel just under 1,400 miles to Chihuahua City in Mexico. The first major stop, being in Santa Fe itself, was roughly 800 miles from Independence. But the Santa Fe Trail was no cakewalk. You still had hostile native tribes that roamed the area, like the Pawnee, Kiowa, and some of the most fearsome warriors the world has ever seen, the Comanche and Apache. Not only that, the Crows and the Arikaras also would travel that far south. But Native American war parties weren't the only struggle of the trail. Myers talks about how this country was, quote, high wind country, and the sun which sucked water holes dry was another enemy. Glass may have worked as one of these merchants for a short time, but it is unclear. If he did, he hated it. It's more likely that he traveled the Santa Fe Trail to Santa Fe, as word had reached him that the rivers were teeming with beaver, and a man could make a good living there. So Glass went southward, and upon arriving in Santa Fe, he joined a fur expedition and worked the Gila River for a time. This is where you're going to hear me say the modern day states that all have names today, like New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. This is so you can have an idea of where Glass was. But remember, there were no borders or states. This was just wilderness. The first state founded in the region would be Texas, but that wouldn't be until 1845, with New Mexico not being founded until 1912. I think it'll just make it easier for everyone to understand exactly where these events took place. The Gila River starts at the headwaters near the Mogollon Mountains and in the Black Range and flows through western New Mexico, through southern Arizona, then into the mighty Colorado River and into the Gulf at California. Glass most likely just trapped in the New Mexico part of the river, as there is no reports of Americans traveling into the territory we call Arizona today, until the following year. But Glass had little success in this area. Side note, this is around the time that Major Henry returns to St. Louis, dissolves his partnership with William Ashley, and retires from the fur trade. He would return to lead mining and die 8 years later in 1832. In 1825, the trappers began looking northward for better beaver grounds, and they decided to travel north to Taos. This is when Glass was hired by a man named Etime Provost to lead a trapping party into the southern Colorado territory of the Utah Indians. Etime Provost raised the capital to give himself a chance to be a fur trader in New Mexico. He saw that Ashley's men were trapping along the upper Missouri and in the northern region of the modern-day United States, but he also saw that his men were having a difficult time getting their furs to St. Louis and into the market. Provost's plan was to send the men out to trap and use Taos as their headquarters, his version of St. Louis, in which to send the furs south to Santa Fe and into the market with the Santa Fe Trail. In theory, it would cut the travel of furs to market, therefore bringing more money into his pocket. So he hired one of the free trappers. Free trappers just meaning a man with no company and no one to answer to. A man by the name of Hugh Glass, a man known for his daring survival and knowledge of the wilderness and fur trapping to lead his expedition. But Glass, instead of heading into the mountains like Provost planned, the group traveled west of the mountains along the rivers of San Juan, the Colorado, the Grand, among many others. If you remember from earlier in the series, Glass doesn't follow orders well, but last time it led to an encounter with old Ephraim. Let's see how it goes this time. When the men were roughly 700 miles from Taos, Glass and some other men were trapping via canoe along the Snake River. They had pulled in several beaver, and along with skinning the animals, they would eat the meat that came with it, with the beaver tail being seen as a delicacy among the trappers. Now I don't believe the trappers thought the beaver tail itself tasted good. You won't see beaver tail at any 5-star restaurants in New York City, but what the beaver tail did have was fat, and lots of it. If you remember from episode 3, these men survived on lean meat and whatever plants they could scrounge up. That fat may have been the greatest thing they've ever tasted because their diets were craving it. George C. Young talks about how on this occasion though, they had a surplus of beaver meat, so when they saw a lone Indian woman seated on the bank of the river, they approached her, possibly to trade for some Indian goods, or just as a charitable donation. But as they approached, they made little sound, and the woman, with her back turned, gave no notice to them. Even as they beached their canoe, the woman still gave no notice. It wasn't until Hugh and some of his men were within feet of her that she noticed them. She stood frantically and let out a bone-chilly scream, and all hell broke loose. Suddenly, a few warriors appeared and let off a volley of arrows towards the trappers, and one trapper was hit and mortally wounded. Glass, not making the same mistake as last time, took his rifle from the boat with him, and began returning fire with the other men, including the man wounded, who in reports killed an Indian. The men then began scrambling back towards the boat, dodging arrows in the process. Glass had a good chance of making it back to the boat, but found the wounded man being unable to reload his rifle, and wanting to take one more man with him before going under. Glass stopped, reloaded his rifle, and took back on his chase to the boat. But turning his back on the warriors a second time, Glass took an arrow to the back. The man Glass stopped to help made use of his rifle and put a ball into the Indian as Glass was running as fast as he could, arrows still protruding from his back. Glass finally made it to the boat, escaping downriver, leaving one dead trapper behind. When the men came ashore at a safe location, they took in what had happened and looked at the arrow in Glass's back. They tried to wiggle it loose, but that wasn't working and was causing Glass a lot of pain. But the men dared not try to cut it out, as the arrow was too close to his spine. Glass only had one option: deal with it as they traveled back to Taos, a journey of about 700 miles. If Glass was nothing else, he was a tough son of a gun. There were no doctors or surgeons in Taos, but it was the closest civilized place to them, and surely someone there could do something. and they were right. The man was no surgeon, but after giving Glass the standard practice of anesthesia, whiskey, and a bullet to chew on, he took a straight razor and cut the arrow from the bone. It'll never cease to amaze me the stuff that happened on the frontier, but cutting an arrow out of a man's back with a straight razor might be on top. The next we hear from Glass, he is fully recovered and is hunting and trapping at the headwaters of the Missouri. Historians aren't exactly sure when Glass ceased to trap out of the headquarters of Taos, but Edmund Flagg does talk about once his spine was back to normal and he was 100% free of any limitations, he took to living completely in the wilds. At some point in 1826, he wouldn't return back to settlements or forts like most men would. Glass had learned to become self-sufficient. Hell, he had survived in the wilds by himself, with wounds that would have killed most men, with nothing but a straight razor. He was living his version of the high life now. He had his rifle, he was healthy, he had nobody to listen to but himself. He could hunt and trap and carve out a fine existence all on his own. But when Glass and other men like him did need supplies, there was something new that had been started, and it was starting to gain steam in the wilderness. We are going to take a little detour here and talk about the creation of the Rendevous. This will be a brief talk as I plan on doing a full episode on the creation and all the events that took place, but here we go. William Ashley and Andrew Henry were not the first ones to take an expedition to the west to trap for furs to put into the market in St. Louis. If you want a little history, go listen to episode 1 of this series. As mentioned before, Andrew Henry abandoned the fur trade in 1824. So William Ashley was alone at the top of his fur company. He wasn't having the success he imagined with taking men and supplies into the wilderness to trap for furs. Therefore, in 1825, he came up with a rendezvous system. He would bring the supplies to the men of his company, as well as buying other furs from other free trappers. But most important to Ashley, he would sell his supplies at inflated prices. Most importantly to the men, however, Ashley brought plenty of whiskey. The first rendezvous would be held in modern-day McKinnon, Wyoming, along Henry's Fork River in July of 1825. These rendezvous were a chance for the men to cut loose after a hard year of trapping and surviving. The men would catch up with acquaintances they hadn't seen in a while, take in who they may have lost, and be able to relax a bit. But before they went to drinking, they first had to buy supplies and goods. The men would maybe get a few things for their rifles, to make some repairs, or maybe just buy a brand new one, get some more powder, new traps or at least stuff to repair their broken ones, maybe a new knife, some other necessary tools for their hard year ahead. Don't forget about buying some trade goods for Indians, some beads, metal goods, maybe some blankets. That's your only chance of survival when you come across a village or roaming party. Then, and only then, after the men bought the supplies they would need for the upcoming trapping season, would they then go and cut loose and enjoy the party and celebration of making it one more year. They would drink, sing, and dance with some of the Native American women. Although it was a giant party and meeting of these legendary fur trappers, these rendezvous were a huge success for William Ashley, and they would change locations year to year and enable men to stay out in the mountains year-round and make a living doing it. There was men from Ashley's Fur Company, Hudson's Bay Company, free trappers, Native American men and women. These were a gathering of men and women of the wilderness. One can imagine the party it must have been. This is when the term mountain man took root. According to HughGlass.org, quote, "Today people usually call them mountain men, the beaver trappers of the Rocky Mountain West. Popular literature and movies often portray them as crusty old coots providing comic relief in cowboy stories. But in their prime, 50 years before the West of the cowboys, the mountain men lived in a mythic period of American history. They usually called themselves mountaineers rather than mountain men. They were mostly young, in their 20s and 30s, daring, curious, or rebellious. Each of them chose to leave the familiarity of the settlements to take part in the first commercial enterprise of the American West, the beaver fur trade." Like I stated earlier, I plan on doing a complete separate episode on these rendezvous in the future, and that will serve as a way for everyone to have a good understanding on what they were and what happened for all future episodes. I plan on covering many of these fur trappers on this podcast, I promise you, there is no shortage of future content. As for Hugh Glass, he was not at the inaugural rendezvous, or at the 1826 rendezvous in modern-day Cache Valley in Utah, but he was there in 1827 when the rendezvous traveled to Bear Lake, which is near Lake Town, Utah. The men would also call Bear Lake by the name of Sweet Lake. The reason was so the men wouldn't get confused with the nearby Salt Lake, which was founded by Jim Bridger in 1824. If you ignore the fact that Native Americans lived in the Great Salt Lake region for, thousands of years prior. Back to the topic. At this time, Jedediah Smith had taken over William Ashley's company. Although William Ashley was still heavily involved in contracting the supplies going to the rendezvous and the furs coming back from them, but he was not present during the 1827 rendezvous. Here, things did not go as planned. Daniel Potts wrote an account of what happened. Quote, "A few days previous to my arrival at this place, a party of about 120 Blackfeet approached the camp and killed a snake and a squaw. The alarm was immediately given, and the Snakes, Utahs, and Whites sallied forth for battle. The enemy fled to the mountain to a small concavity thickly grown with small timber, surrounded by open ground. In this engagement, the squaws were busily engaged in throwing up batteries and dragging off the dead. There were only 6 whites engaged in this battle, who immediately advanced within pistol shot, and you may be assured that every shot counted 1. The loss of the Snakes were 3 killed and the same wounded. That of the Whites, 1 wounded, and 2 narrowly made their escape. That of the Utahs was none, though who gained great applause for their bravery. The loss of the enemy is not known. 6 were found dead on the ground, besides a great number were carried off on horses." According to Intermountain Histories, Blackfeet individuals entered the camp hell-bent on murdering a man and a woman from the Snake tribe. But the trappers had already had plenty of issues with Blackfeet themselves, and the Snake were friendly to them. Therefore, a battle erupted after the man and woman were killed. It's unclear the role Glass played in this encounter, but what we do know is he most likely attended the 1827 rendezvous. Glass would spend the next year trapping and thriving in the wilderness, before attending the 1828 rendezvous, which was again at Bear Lake. This year, 200 to 300 Blackfeet warriors conducted an attack on a small wagon train that was just miles from the rendezvous site. They would have been easily overcome if it wasn't for 70 or so trappers and a few hundred friendly natives that would come to reinforce the wagon train, causing the Blackfeet to sink away back into the wilderness. There is a legend that the friendly natives sent out a war party and returned a few days later with some fresh enemy scalps, but I do not know how much truth is behind it. Prior to the 1828 rendezvous, Ashley was the only major player in terms of selling supplies and goods to the fur trappers. Whether company men, meaning men who worked for a company, such as the Hudson's Bay Company or Rocky Mountain Fur Company, etc., these men didn't even own their own rifles or traps, whereas the fur trappers did not work for any company, so everything they had to buy with their own money. But every beaver they caught was theirs to turn for a profit. In short, Ashley wasn't paying top dollar for the pelts and was charging an incredibly high price for supplies and goods. But at the 1828 rendezvous, there would be a major shakeup in the fur trade. John Jacob Astor hired a Scotch man by the name of Kenneth Mackenzie. The King of the Missouri, as the man began calling him, was put in charge of, quote, bringing all the bacon in sight home to Wall Street. What this means is bringing the money from the fur trade back to John Jacob Astor in New York. Again, I'm not going to go into every detail as I will do a very deep dive into this in the future, but here's how it pertains to Hugh Glass. Like stated earlier, Ashley had a monopoly at these rendezvous and paid little for furs and charged greatly for supplies. Mackenzie sought to seek an end to it from his newly established fort up north on the Missouri. Originally named Fort Floyd, Mackenzie sent a messenger in E-Time Provost, who found his way into the American Fur Company after the failed venture in New Mexico. Provost's job was to tell the men at the rendezvous that Mackenzie was paying top dollar for high-quality pelts, meaning high mountain beaver pelts. In colder temperature, beaver pelts grew thicker than the beaver pelts in lower, warmer climates. Mackenzie's plan was to draw the best of the best in the trapping world, to move north, knowing that that's where they would make the most money. What he didn't mention is although he would pay top dollars for pelts, he would charge more than Ashley for supplies and goods, knowing that without the supplies, the way of life that these men chose would be awfully difficult to accomplish. Mackenzie had the right idea, but Jedediah Smith, David Jackson, and Bill Sublett, remember, they took over William Ashley's fur company, with Ashley still managing the Rendevous in the background, had one thing going for them. The men didn't want to leave the Rocky Mountains, and didn't want to forego the idea of the Rendevous, with the social gathering and market that had been established. So the trappers were in a bit of a pickle. They didn't want to leave the Rocky Mountains, but they also weren't satisfied with prices they were getting from Ashley and Smith's operation. Therefore, the men named Hugh Glass as a delegate for the fur trappers, and specifically the free trappers. And after the 1828 rendezvous, sent him to Fort Floyd to talk with Mackenzie, and asked them to send a trade caravan to the 1829 rendezvous. This would allow the men to receive competitive prices for both their pelts and their supplies. From the 1828 Bear Lake Rendezvous, Hugh Glass traveled east over the Rocky Mountains towards the headwaters of the Bighorn River. From there, he built some sort of craft, most likely a bull boat, and traveled the river to Fort Henry, the same place where he confronted a young Jim Bridger. Now traveling on the Yellowstone, he would have had to travel through the territory of the Mandan, and traveling against the current, he finally arrived at the place where in the past he expected to slaughter Fitzgerald, the location of the old Fort Henry, which was replaced by the new Fort Floyd. Mackenzie planned Fort Floyd to serve as the headquarters of the entire Western fur trade. Kenneth Mackenzie wrote that the delegate for the free trappers was Hugh Glass. Glass then talked with Mackenzie about sending a caravan full of trade goods to the next rendezvous. The reason being is it would break Ashley's backed Rocky Mountain Fur Company's monopoly. Like stated last episode, it would create a more competitive market and therefore better prices for furs and cheaper supplies. Mackenzie would have loved to do so, but there were two main reasons he couldn't. The first was he didn't have the trained personnel to take the caravan through the Rockies in time to make the 1929 rendezvous. The men needed for this type of journey needed to be experienced in that profession. They knew the exact trails in which were safe, watering and feeding points for the animals, and the territories of the friendly versus hostile native tribes. But unfortunately, Mackenzie did not have these type of men. The second was Mackenzie had a strong determination for his plan, for Fort Floyd to be the main headquarters of the fur trade. While the supplies were still en route to the fort, he knew that he was close to having everything he needed for his ultimate goal. But Mackenzie was still missing the most important part of his plan, the fur trappers. Therefore, the conversation gravitated towards Mackenzie's plan and tried to sweeten the deal for the free trappers. Mackenzie asked to return to the other free trappers and tell them that they could operate anywhere they choose, and in return for them signing contracts with the American Fur Company out of Fort Floyd, that Mackenzie would guarantee better prices than the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. It was a solid offer, but the issue was that it linked these free mountain men to a precise point on the map. As Myers puts it, quote, "That cut at the mountain man pride, for one of their boasts had come to be that there were no strings which bound them to anything resembling the channeled ways of life which they had left behind in the States." The number of free trappers that took this deal was lost to history, or just not tracked. We do not know for sure, but we can assume that Glass made it to the 1829 rendezvous to let his fellow trappers know how his meeting with Mackenzie went. Which one he attended is unknown. There was 2 different locations that year. According to thefurtrapper.com, quote, "The 1829 rendezvous on the Poposia or Little Wind River, north of Lander, Wyoming, was the first rendezvous to be held east of the Continental Divide. There was a small gathering of mountain men on the Poposia, and as soon as the trading was concluded, Sublett left with the remaining trade goods to find his partners, Jedediah Smith and David Jackson. Sublett traveled over the Togawee Pass into Jackson's Hole, and then over the Teton Pass into Prairie's Hole. Sublett found Jedediah Smith, who had been in the Oregon country for 2 years, and David Jackson. Robert Newell recorded there was 175 mountain men at the second rendezvous. The 1829 rendezvous is sometimes referred to as a split rendezvous. In 1830, Fort Floyd would be abandoned and burned by Mackenzie's men, and a new fort was built, and they named it Fort Union. The reason they burned and destroyed Fort Floyd was so that it could not be used by a competing company. Fort Union was built bigger and better and was placed 200 miles farther up the Missouri River. When Fort Union was completed, it was just as intimidating as Mackenzie wanted. Quote, 20 feet tall, paling hewn from tree trunks walked around an area 240 feet long by 200 in width. The southwest and northeast corners were guarded by the stone bastions, 20 feet square and 30 feet high. The lower stories of these were pierced for cannon. The big guns could be used to police the plaza as well as to keep hostiles at a distance. It was an imposing fort and Mackenzie knew it. But what many of the fur trappers seemed not to know, or just didn't care because in the grand scheme of things, it did not include them. But there was something different about Kenneth Mackenzie. He played dirty. He would pay Native Americans with firewater, better known as whiskey, and other times with supplies to hijack furs from other, smaller fur companies. Mackenzie would rob out anybody that was not on his team. But he was also a man who knew how to play the person that he needed. Therefore, that's why it's believed that the free trappers like Glass had no idea, for they were paid fair for their work. After the creation of Fort Union, Hugh Glass made the decision to remain a free trapper. This gave him the ability to live life as he wanted. He wasn't tied down as a company man, but he could also make good money in trapping. But he didn't stray too far from the fort, as he would also hunt for Fort Union. This gave him the opportunity to make some extra money along with the trapping he was doing. We know this because Edmund Flagg talked about how Glass only took beaver that he found east of the Great Divide. But a huge change was coming to the fur trade, and Glass's old rival was at the forefront, Jim Bridger. No longer a young buck, Jim Bridger was making a name for himself. When Jedediah Smith, David Jackson, and Bill Sublett had made the decision to sell the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, Jim Bridger was in line to take over the annual Rendevous. Jim was liked and admired for his decency and honesty, but he was also admired for his work as an Indian fighter. But Tom, soon to be nicknamed Broken Hand Fitzpatrick, was the quote, signal caller. He was the jefe of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Fitzpatrick then chose his associates. He first brought on Milton Sublett, brother of Bill Sublett, who had the amazing nickname of the Thunderbolt of the Rockies. Next, he chose Henry Frabb, who is unfortunately known as being the ugliest corpse a bullet had ever put on display. And lastly, he chose Jim Bridger, who is in charge of these annual rendezvous. Myers states, quote, Jim had become one of the high rollers of the mountain fur trade. He was one of those who set up the rendezvous layout, issued the chips, called their values, dealt the cards, and raked in the profits. It is unclear whether Glass or Bridger crossed paths again at these rendezvous, as we don't know if Glass attended any rendezvous after 1829, in which we aren't sure if he even attended that one. But Myers talked about it as a thing that didn't need to be brought up again. Both Jim Bridger and Hugh Glass were good men who were good at what they did. They had their conversation about it, and it was in the past. It was time to move on. Also, Bridger was working his way up the fur trade mountain, trying to build a prosperous life for himself, as Glass was seeming to just settle in as a trapper and hunter for Fort Union, and he was making a name for himself as a hunter. According to HughGlass.org, Hiram Chinnington talks about how Glass, quote, worked as a hunter for Fort Union and harvested so many bighorn sheep on the hillside opposite the fort, these hills became known as the Glass Bluffs. An 1874 map of the territory of Montana showed the bluffs near the mouth of the Yellowstone still being identified as Glass Bluffs. More would be known of Hugh Glass's movements during this time if a manuscript written by a man named J.A. Hamilton can ever be found. Mackenzie, while in St. Louis, where the headquarters of American Fur Company, known as Armfrico, was located. He met an Englishman that was walking on thin ice from past actions, but Myers writes, quote, he was well educated, a stickler for correct duds, and owned a case of gout won by his devotion to port and other hopped up wines. Mackenzie needed a bookkeeper, and Hamilton, doing his best to avoid his past deeds, was more than willing to travel far into the wilderness, where no Briton would find him. But Hamilton hated the wilderness. He craved clean clothes and a daily bath. Surrounded by the men at Fort Union that rarely bathed or changed clothes, it drove him crazy. But more than anything, he hated Indians. With Hamilton being in command over the fort whenever Mackenzie was gone, as an Armfico hand by the name of Larpenteur told of how Hamilton would regularly have the cannon ready toward the Indians that threatened the hospitality of the fort. But the isolation of the fort did have its benefits for Hamilton. For one, Mackenzie kept a cellar of different types of alcohol, and it allowed Hamilton to keep his gout at bay. The second, it gave the ability for wealthy sportsmen from faraway places to hunt the wild beasts of the western frontier. Mackenzie was a cultured man, and did his best to make a pleasing host, and word spread that near the mouth of the Yellowstone, there was a place where good hunts and strong drinks could be had. One of these foreigners was named, and bear with me, Prince Alexander Philip Maximilian Zuid Nieuweed. Where is Weed Nieuweed? Glad you asked. I definitely didn't Google it. I know it off the top of my head. It's in Western Germany. So yeah, definitely knew that. I'm gonna call him Prince Maximilian. Prince Maximilian gives us an interesting showing of something that Hamilton became interested in his time in the West. It was a man named Hugh Glass. Hamilton wrote an article that was based on interviews he had with Glass, and he planned on publishing it. But like stated earlier, it has never been located. But Prince Maximilian does give us a bit of what Hamilton wrote, as the two spoke during his time at the fort. From here on out, you'll hear Maximilian's name come up here and there. Regarding Hamilton, he would soon return back east to St. Louis, where he took up being the cashier for Armfico until gout finally took his life in late 1840. In the fall of 1832, Armfico would build a new fort. This would be called Fort Cass, also known as Tulloch's Fort, because of the man who coordinated the building of it. According to Nathaniel Wythe, quote, "It stands about 3 miles below the mouth of the Bighorn, on the east bank of the Yellowstone River, is about 130 foot square, made of sapling cottonwood pickets, with 2 bastions at extreme corners." Fort Cass was established mainly for trade with the Crow. The country was considered safe, especially during the wintertime, as many roaming war parties would normally stay within their own villages. Even the Arikaras, who after the fur trappers burned their village along the Missouri, would not return to their tradition of having a massive village in which they stayed in year-round. Post-Arikara War, they would join the other Plains Indians' traditions in becoming wandering teepee dwellers. But the Arikaras were different, as most native tribes of the Plains had certain domains of their homeland. As you've heard me say, this is Blackfeet country, or Sioux, or Crow. The Arikaras roamed everywhere, sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile. At this time, in 1833, they were in the area of Fort Cass. Another man in the area was Hugh Glass, who had made Fort Cass his home, especially during the wintertime. According to an Armfico ledger book, during the years of 1831 through 1833, it states, Hugh Glass, Freeman. These same ledgers also show that another famous free trapper, who had traveled to Fort Union during the same time as Glass, was Johnson Gardner. This obviously wasn't the same man as the one Glass wrote the letter to his father, but a different man. Another man who was there was Ed Rose, who had fought along Hugh Glass in the past. Nobody knows for sure the exact day, but sometime in the early spring of 1833, Glass, Ed Rose, and one other man named Hillen Menard left Fort Cass to trap for beaver. They were in the territory of a friendly tribe and had the post at their back. As they were crossing the frozen river, carefully, one step at a time as to not fall through the melting ice, the Rees were waiting. George C. Young recounts that Hugh and the other members had been ambushed by members of the tribe that had 4 times in the past failed to kill him. Maximilian writes, quote, "Old Glass, with 2 companions, had gone from Fort Cass to hunt beavers on the Yellowstone, and as they were crossing the ice farther down, they were all 3 shot, scalped, and plundered by a war party of 30 Arikaras, who were concealed on the opposite bank. James Beckworth claimed that he found the 3 bodies lying on the icy river. Please take this next part with a grain of salt, as Beckworth, as stated before, stretched the truth regularly. But he states, quote, "We returned together and buried the 3 men, amid the most terrible scenes that I have ever witnessed. The crying was truly appalling. The 3 men were well known and highly esteemed by the Crows. When their bodies were lowered to their last resting place, numberless fingers were voluntarily chopped off and thrown into the graves. Hair and trinkets of every description were also contributed, and the graves were finally filled up." Did this happen? It is possible. As you will learn in our next short dive, Ed Rose was highly regarded among the Crow, and Hugh Glass had many friendly encounters with them, and there are other instances of the Crow tribe cutting off fingers in the mourning of lost loved ones. For example, according to Distinctly Montana, in 1880 in Junction City, the son of Chief Big Ox of the Crow tribe was killed, and in the process of mourning, quote, "The natives on the reservation entered into a lengthy period of mourning, during which they cut off joints of their fingers and made small cuts on their heads and shoulders." So it is possible, but nothing is verified besides James Beckworth's account. A few weeks later, Johnson Gardner and some other trappers were outside of Fort Cass, trapping and hunting, when a small group of Arikaras came into their camp trying to disguise themselves as a different tribe, looking to warm themselves by the fire. But Gardner noticed something. One of the men was wearing some clothes he recognized. He was also carrying a rifle that all the men recognized. It was a rifle of Hugh Glass. The men captured the small party, scalped them, and burned them alive, a way of avenging their old friends that had been killed. The exact encounter is unknown, as there are several different accounts and stories, but here is what we know. Prince Maximilian recounts that a man named Johnson Gardner gifted him one of the scalps from the Arikara warriors. He writes that Gardner told him, quote, "One of them had Old Glass's knife, and his rifle had been seen in the possession of these Indians." John F.A. Sanford wrote to the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, William Clark, stating, quote, "John Soy Gardner caught up with a couple of the murderers a few weeks later and burned them to death." And finally, Edmund Flagg was like most men in the area. They did not know exactly what happened to Glass and the other men, but most men expected the reason of the deed, and he writes, quote, "Nothing was now heard of Glass for several months. At length a party of 4 Arikara Indians came into the encampment of a company of hunters on the banks of the Pawnee River, and on one of these was seen several articles of clothing, which from their peculiar character were known to have belonged to Glass. The savages were immediately seized, and on declaring entire ignorance of the fate of the hunter, one of the party was released with assurance that unless he returned within 24 hours with Glass in safety, his 3 companions who remained as hostages should be burned at the stake. The prescribed period passed away with the messenger's appearance, and being now sure that the unfortunate hunter had been murdered by the savages, then in their hands, the order was given by the leader of the party named Gardner to burn them alive. But Flagg would later state in 1839, quote, "Not long afterwards Gardner himself fell into the hands of the Arikara, who inflicted upon him the same dreadful death." The man who survived being a pirate against his will, somehow avoided being sacrificed, lived to tell the harrowing and legendary tale of surviving a bear attack, being stranded by his companions, and traveled thousands of miles while making it through countless Indian attacks to get his beloved rifle back, and everything else we discussed. Glass had finally fell victim to the tribe that had come close to killing him several times previous. I think Myers puts the obsession with Hugh Glass's story and something we love of these frontier mountain men into perspective. I'm going to read the last 2 pages of his book, and I think it's a great way to end this series. Quote, "As Glass never had to make the adjustments forced on so many of his fellows, he is the purest known example of the American in buckskin. Daniel Boone did not at all rival him. Boone was always on the fringe of pioneer settlement. While his repeatedly proved ambition was to be a great landholder, Glass functioned when and where a settlement wasn't yet dreamed of, and he had no more use for a tie to any place of real estate than he had for the leg irons of organized society. In that corner imperial Rome, and is this one, Hugh, There was a long drift away from the community building spirit brought to the new world from the old. It found its ebb in the boom times of beaver trapping, and its epitome in a man whose story was as primal as the fear of falling. It is not watered by a tinge of romance, patriotism, or a sense of owed obligation. It is undiluted by the spirit of daring do, the desire for wealth, and ambition for honors, or any other feeling with one-eyed cock for applause or envy. It springs only from a hard-mouthed will to thrive again, in the fact of catalysm. Older literatures have saved nothing like it, for by the time the Sumerians had begun saving tales in cuneiform, the wilderness had been left so far behind that any remembered prowlers of it could be seen only through the smoky lens of myth. The world had to wait another 6,000 years before the lost chance turned up again. Then the American plunged westward, made something besides savages at home in the primordial. And this time, literacy was more or less watching. Other cuttings from American history could be cited as general cases in point, but only one is absolute. There was once a civilized, modern man who was thrust as far back in dawn living conditions as Pithecanthropus, and there left desperately crippled. The tale of what he did thereafter is splintered by differing reportings, and it must be pieced together with the aid of side remarks sifted from documents dealing with other matters. Yet the principal events can be clearly followed. However fragmentary its form, the narrative is a great one. It is likewise, according to the verdict returned with its appraisal, a thoroughly true one. It is the story of Hugh Glass, pirate, Pawnee, and mountain man. Now let's go into some common questions on Hugh Glass and the events we've discussed in this series. What kind of rifle did Hugh Glass own? It is unknown exactly the type of rifle Glass used. It is believed that it was most likely a Hawken rifle that Glass custom modified to his liking, as the Hawken was the most popular rifle of the time, but again, it is not verified. But it is reported throughout the life of Hugh Glass from several trappers that he had one of the finest rifles known to man. What happened to his rifle? According to Myers, he states, quote, "It had been seen in Arikara hands, but what later became of it is little known as the whereabouts of J.A. Palmer's biographical work. He is referencing Hamilton. It seems he took the name Palmer when he traveled to St. Louis. But regardless, nobody knows what happened to it. Myers also states that if Hamilton's manuscripts are ever located, we may find something that gives us knowledge of where it is. But until then, we have nothing to go off of. What happened to John Fitzgerald? Nobody knows. I've tried to find any information I could on what happened to him once Glass unsuccessfully attempted a meeting with him. But there is no word anywhere. But at the time, a man could desert from the army, or be discharged, head into the wilderness, and could die any number of ways, and nobody would ever know. But in terms of verified information, there is none. Was it really Jim Bridger that abandoned Hugh Glass? Oh yes, the very controversial topic. Was it really Jim Bridger? There is one article from 1838, written by Edmund Flagg, that mentions the names John Fitzgerald and a younger man, Bridges. Bridges, not Bridger. Then who the hell was this Bridges guy? So it wasn't Jim Bridger at all? Well, it could be as simple as Flagg wrote it down wrong or heard it incorrectly. But also, James Cook and Yount both point to a youth that turned 19 in 1823. Jim Bridger was born, we know for sure, in 1804, so that lines up. Also, as far as we know, he was the only member of Ashley's first two expeditions, according to Myers, that wasn't at least 21 years of age. It seems Jim lied about his age before departure to not miss out on the opportunity. Next, there are many verified inaccuracies in Flagg's account of Glass's life, and while doing research, I had to be careful with a lot of his writings because of it. But did Jim Bridger ever admit to it? We have a ton of research available from his life and his writings. He should have mentioned it. Then we would know for sure that it was him. Well, the only time Bridger ever made mention of it was to a man named James Stevenson, in which Stevenson stated, quote, "Bridger told me the story of your Glass, but there was no desertion." Was Bridger the youth of 17 that stayed behind with Glass? Although we don't know for fact if it was him or not, It is believed that many people that are way smarter and way more researched than me that believe Jim Bridger was there. What are y'all thoughts? Email me. This is something I'd love to have a conversation with y'all about. Lastly, were there ever songs or shows or movies about Hugh Glass? Yes, many times. According to HughGlass.org, these are a few of them. The Song of Hugh from 1915, written by the poet John C. Heehart. Next was a novel written in 1954 by Frederick Mandred titled Lord Grizzly. A 1971 movie starring Richard Harris and John Huston named Man of the Wilderness. A song from 2011 titled 6 Weeks by the Iceland Band of Monsters and Men. And lastly, the movie The Revenant starring Leonardo DiCaprio. Now, let's deep dive into this. Oh boy, let's dive in, shall we? Here's your spoiler alert. If you haven't seen the movie, here's your warning, but here we go. I thought about saying that the movie wasn't historically accurate at all, but instead, I'm going to do sort of a scene-by-scene breakdown, because I thought it would be interesting and fun. I also don't want to come off as if I hated the movie, and now I'm just hating on it. I just want to give the account of what really happened versus what the movie showed. Before this, my overall opinion of The Revenant is that it's not an accurate representation of Hugh Glass's life. They took a ton of Hollywood liberties and made the story so different than the actual life of Glass. But they did get some scenes of his life somewhat correct. However, if you are watching it for entertainment, it's a pretty good movie. The scenes and the men look authentic. I like the surprises and the equipment, the clothing, that all looked great. But they did this weird thing where Glass hallucinated about his dead wife and was protecting his son, and yeah, it was all Hollywood being Hollywood. Glass never mentioned having a wife or son. So let's get that straightened out right away. Alright, the opening scene is the battle between the fur trappers on the beach and the Arikaras on high ground. It wasn't the greatest display of what really happened. They tried to show how they were taken by surprise, but then they had warriors in the trees. It doesn't really show the high ground the Arikaras had. They had warriors just calmly looting dead trappers as there was this huge scramble to the boat, and it was just weird. But I do think they did a good job of the gruesomeness of the battle. Men getting killed by several arrows or balls from the rifles, the men in a full-blown retreat to the boat, dropping rifles, running for their life. I thought that was really good detail. But they did show hand-to-hand combat, which never happened. And why did the dude just shoot his horse super calmly? I didn't like that. I love horses. But overall, it wasn't historically accurate, but hey, it's a movie. As the boat was floating down the river, you can hear a man praying, and I thought that was a great detail they included. This would have been Jedediah Smith, so good on them for that. Glass was not the leader of the expedition. In the movie he was, but there are no reports of that at all being true. Fast forward to the bear attack scene. I thought they did an amazing job with this. Him stumbling upon the mother and her 2 cubs, him getting a wayward shot off, they show him getting his throat cut and his arm almost ripped off. In the movie the bear just falls over Glass. They don't show the men appearing and shooting the bear, but to their credit, we don't know exactly what happened and how the bear actually died. So I thought overall they did a great job with this scene. The litter they used in the movie I thought was pretty cool because it looks authentic and how they would have transported him, so good on them. I think they did a good job with how the men volunteered. It shows how the men were hesitant, knowing that it was a death mission, and then it shows Fitzgerald was doing it for money, thinking it would be a couple days and just good money. Again, I know I mentioned it before, but with the Pawnee wife and son and him having the hallucinations about her and them getting attacked by the United States Army and all that, I really didn't like it. It threw off the whole movie for me knowing the real story of Hugh Glass. The best part was the random hallucination of the famous display of buffalo skulls that we have all probably seen. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Google Mountain of Buffalo Skulls, as long as you aren't driving or operating heavy machinery. They showed him thinking of that, but in reality, that picture was taken in 1892, almost 60 years after Glass was dead. The whole thing is just weird. When it came time for Fitzgerald and Bridger leaving Glass behind, besides the whole Fitzgerald killing Glass's son thing, I do think they did a good job of how Fitzgerald was really pressuring Bridger to leave by lying about a large party of Arikaras. We don't know exactly how Fitzgerald convinced them, so their version seemed good. When Glass finally had the strength to move, I thought they did a good job with him crawling with his leg behind, all broken and twisted, and how much of a struggle it was. I thought that was a good detail. As well as him taking the skin for a large blanket to stay warm. And when he found the first buffalo carcass, he ate the bone marrow, and we know he actually did that, so they did a good job showing that. I thought they did a really good job of showing how much difficulty he was having with drinking water. But they did show Glass putting shot powder on his throat, then making a fire and putting the fire to the power to seal up his throat. It seemed like a lot, as I don't even know if it would work, but hey, I guess anything is possible. But we know he did not have shot powder on him, so this was weird. The Arikaras finding him on the river and shooting at him as he swam down river may have been referencing to when Glass encountered them. But it was the wrong timing, as the next scene was him finding the buffalo carcass with the wolves, then an Indian scaring them off with fire, then the Indian helping him, but then getting hanged, and then Glass steals a horse from these French trappers. I'm going to guess it was a combination of a few events that happened in Glass's life. Him finding the carcass, scaring off the wolves, then being picked up by the Sioux, and them looking for him. But in the movie he found French trappers. They would have been delighted to see him and would have helped him. But I guess it isn't the worst display ever. I thought they did a good job of how the Arikara surprised them. I think that was just a testament to life on the frontier. One second it's calm, and the next is mayhem. But he never slept inside the carcass of his dead horse. Alright, last time I'm going to mention it. Why the hallucinations? If you were going to do it, make it about his vengeance to get back at Fitzgerald. Alright, I'm done. I promise I won't mention it again. I didn't mind the movie's version of how Fitzgerald found out that Glass was still alive. It's not exactly how it went down, but it was still good. The way they found Glass I didn't mind either. I know it wasn't exactly how it happened, but I like how Andrew Henry's character took custody of Bridger immediately, and how he sent men to find Fitzgerald right away. They also mentioned someone named Bill. This might have been a tie to Bill Sublet. Cool detail. The chase of Fitzgerald was obviously Hollywood doing its thing, as it never happened and Fitzgerald never killed Andrew Henry. As we know, Henry left the fur trade and went back to mining. So again, Hollywood being Hollywood. Finally, the end fight scene with Glass and Fitzgerald was completely made up. But I will say the trick Glass pulled was pretty badass, with him putting Henry riding upright to trick him, but the fight was a lot. And in the end, Glass never gave Fitzgerald to the Arikara in this weird, we hate each other but we equally hate this guy more, so you can have him type thing. That was just weird. Again, overall, if you're watching The Revenant from an entertainment standpoint, it is a great movie. I thought they did a great job of showing what frontier life would have been like, so good on them for that. But if you're watching it to get the real life events of Glass's life, I'm sorry, you won't find it there. Hugh Glass was a legendary frontiersman that lived a life that many people would have believed to have been a legend story, if it wasn't for his fellow trappers and people who knew him who gave the accounts of his very real actions. He walked through hell and made it out on the other side, and gained his legendary status through true grit and determination. I hope y'all enjoyed this series. I had a blast researching and producing it. Our next deep dive will be on the legendary U.S. Deputy Marshal of Indian Territory, Bass Reeves. That'll be a fun one. If you like Wild West deep dives, please give a rating on whichever platform you are currently listening. Thanks y'all for the support, and please email me with any comments, questions, concerns, and I will try my best to get back to you. You can email me at wildwestdeepdives@gmail.com. And remember, when in doubt, shoot straight, shoot fast. God bless.